in the waiting room. So we are recording. Hello, let me support this. All right. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us for our Addressing Minneapolis Racial Wealth Divide Summit. We are proud to center today's event on the intersections of funding and investment, engaging in policy design and advocacy, and effective cross-sector collaboration to address the racial wealth divide. My name is Ebony White, Program Prosperity Now Director of the Racial Economic Justice Team, previously known as the Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, where our role is to bring expertise, strategies, practices, and knowledge rooted in racial economic equity to support how best to be in partnership with, in service to, and support of BIPOC leaders working to advance economic mobility and asset building strategies for those furthest from economic justice. The team provides socioeconomic tailored capacity building, technical assistance to catalyze the leadership, organizational management, service delivery, advocacy, and policy efforts of the leaders. And we leverage data in partnership with our leaders to drive community level interventions to bring forth a racial, economic, and wealth equity analysis to the field and inform promising best practices, policies, and solutions. Today's summit is part of a larger initiative, the Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color project that is funded by JP Morgan Chase. The program uses a three-pronged approach to support and our partners. We equip them with the capacity building, the leadership development, help to really deepen the understanding of Seattle's racial wealth divide by developing the racial wealth divide profiles, which I will speak to a little bit later, as well as advancing their visibility and increasing their networks as thought partners in this work to include more funders, more funding partnerships locally, as well as with other asset building national institutions. And we really want to make sure that their voices are heard throughout this whole summit. So this is a summit that they did co-develop with each other. The cohort includes 5 organizations: African American Leadership Forum, African Development Center, Build Wealth Minnesota, Hope Community CDC, Northside Economic Opportunity Network, known as NEON. And it has been a pleasure working in partnership and support of all of them. And again, their voices will be seen and heard throughout this whole convening. Now it is my pleasure to introduce my leader, Gary Cunningham, CEO of Prosperity Now. This afternoon, he will share with us all his vision and of how at Prosperity Now, we are reaching racial and economic equity in our country and how Prosperity Now is working daily to help close that racial wealth divide. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Gary. Thank you.
All right. And I'm going to be brief. I know many of y'all don't believe that of me, but I'll be as brief as I can. I see really a lot of old friends here. I see Senator Hayden and Nikki Foster and Robert Harper. I could go on and on with Warren, Alfredo, et cetera. I just want to thank all of you for coming together to have this conversation that I know many of us have had in different forms, in different venues for a while. The question for us, I think, today and as we proceed is what actions are we going to take? What are we going to do to address the racial economic wealth divide in America? I just want to say that it is good to kind of be at home but not be there at the same time. And that, you know, I do miss a lot of interactions with Nasibu and Tessa, who's on the line, and others. I want to start off by, and I won't be able to name everybody, but I want to start off by thanking my staff, Ebony White, Vanner Cure, and Madeline Santana for putting this event together and working with all of you on how can we increase the capacity, the leadership, and the impact of nonprofits of color. And then I also want to thank my friend Damien, who's on the line. I haven't seen Damien, I don't know how long, from JP Morgan Chase, who actually had the vision when we started off down this road when I was on the board of Prosperity Now, thinking about how do we actually work on the ground to transform issues, because a lot of times folks are in think tanks or they're here at the Capitol in the bubble, and it really is the work on the ground. It's the work that all of you are doing that is really the glue that will transform America and address the racial economic inequalities in America. So it's not something that's going to come on high, but it's actually going to come from the voices that each of you all bring to the table. Prosperity Now has been on a journey over the last 18 months. And part of that is a couple of things. One is we're a national organization. We're focused very extremely on how do we address racial and ethnic economic justice in America. And we do that through several means. One is research and policy, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. The other is programmatic approaches that we are doing here, and nationwide demonstration projects around the country. And so we're doing a demonstration project with many of you on the phone, including some with Mita and others who are partners with us to see how do we change the dynamic and the trajectory of people of color. But we also have made a decision not to work on the Band-Aids, not to work on mitigating the effects of a broken system, but really to get at the root causes of addressing economic inequalities in America. And so a lot of our focus is on what are those root causes, how do we address that, and then how do we demonstrate that so that it can be scaled. So with that, I'm going to stop myself because I don't want to get the hook. But I just want to say thank you to our presenters. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the folks that are here that are rolling up your sleeve. And most of all, thank you for the hundreds, if not thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that we could help doing this work. So with that, I will say adieu and I will listen in. I won't be able to be here for the whole time, but let me introduce my friend Damien, who I haven't seen, Damien Herron, who I haven't seen in I don't know how long, Damien, a while, but at least 2 or 3 years. But JP Morgan Chase is a huge partner of Prosperity Now and a huge stalwart in this work. So thank you, Damien, for being here. Damien.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. I am also going to be very brief because I am also already at a handicap having to follow Gary, which Gary, it's good to see you. Glad to know that you're still a partner to us in DC, and hopefully I'll get to visit there soon. And so it's good to see some of our partners on the call as well. Many of you have been partners to us in this work for years, and glad to see some friendly faces in the crowd. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to be very brief. JP Morgan Chase has been partnering with Prosperity Now for many years. And I think Minneapolis is the 8th or 9th city where we've done this program or a like project. And, with each city, I think the work gets deeper and more robust, and it continues to reinforce for us how important it is to kind of focus on investing in Black and Brown-led organizations, focus on Black and Brown communities. Actually, I should say BIPOC communities. JP Morgan Chase is not new to Minneapolis, though we are expanding. And we now have 300 employees across the state. We have 1 million consumer customers, and we are just getting started. It's been incredibly important for us as we expand across the market to show up authentically, to dedicate ourselves to listening to the community, listening to our partners, to figure out what it is that they need and how we can show up as a strong partner not just to businesses, but to the community and our nonprofit partners. And we knew that it was important that we cannot be a successful business. We can't be a successful community without strong partners, without strong Black and Brown led organizations across the communities that we serve. We know it's important for us to listen and to address the concerns that we are hearing from our partners. And one of those concerns is the gap that exists between white-led organizations and their BIPOC counterparts. So this program is intent in making sure that our leaders, our BIPOC leaders, have the resources they need to be successful, that they have the networks they need to be successful, and that they can fundraise and have the agency that they need to kind of do what community needs. And so this program is very much focused on that. And we are proud of the work that we've done, both philanthropically, having invested over $2.2 million in Minneapolis neighborhoods, and the work that we've done with the business, the diversity of those that we've hired, putting branches in communities and proximate to the people who need services, and hiring great talent to help us deliver on that. So this is one part of the way that JPMorgan Chase hopes to show up across Minneapolis communities. And so we thank you for being here today to listen to these conversations. We look forward to kind of doing more with you and for our communities. And with that, I will stop and say, on behalf of all of my colleagues, welcome and enjoy the program.
Thank you, Damien. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the profile that was released earlier this year. Just give me 1 second to show my screen. All right, so at Prosperity Now, we really like to ground conversations in data to really help tell the story of the lived experiences of what's happening in communities of color. And so what I'm gonna do to just make it a little bit more easier, even though I'm pretty sure folks in this audience understand some of the historical pieces, I'm gonna highlight some just to help draw just further understanding of why we have the economic equities that we still have today. And also, am I frozen on? I'm sorry, I feel like I'm frozen.
You're not frozen,
Nope,
the screen is
not
blank.
frozen.
Okay, my computer is just frozen on me. Hold on 1 second, sorry guys. Oh. See if I let me do it this way. All right, I'm getting somewhere. Sorry about that, guys. All right, so first I'm going to talk about some of the historical policies and practices. And so we cannot talk about the remedies of the growing economic inequalities without not just properly understanding what has happened in our past. And so I'm going to just review real quickly some of the legacy of discrimination and how it has a direct impact on every dimension of the families of color's life. And I will describe these impacts and intersections as it relates to communal wealth, family wealth, income, housing, and education, to name a few. The photos you see right here, it demonstrates the oppression of Native Americans and African Americans for land and labor in favor of economic gains. And throughout the 246 years of slavery in the US, forced and free labor from enslaved people and the loss of millions of acres of land, it just really allowed white slave owners to accumulate massive amounts of wealth and really to be able to have the intergenerational wealth that you're seeing in communities today. And cards were stacked from the beginning to systemically exclude people of color from prosperity. The Social Security Act of 1935 excluded 1/3 of all American workers, including farm workers and domestic workers who were predominantly people of color. And for African Americans, the cost of this exclusion resulted in a loss of benefits totaling over 143.20 billion in 2016. And then there was mass investments to create American middle class. However, what really came was a white American middle class. And so we have other factors, such as the inequality that we see today. A lot is connected to the federally sanctioned housing discrimination, where the Federal Housing Administration, along with just other public and private actors like the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, they intentionally shut out households of color from the opportunity to purchase a home through the practice of redlining. And despite, I would say, FHA's goal of making homeownership accessible to more American households, the underwriting practices it implemented during its first 35 years resulted in home buyers of color receiving just 2% of the government-backed mortgages. So ultimately, this practice not only set the stage for homeownership to become the largest driver of the racial wealth divide that we see today, but it also shaped literally the communities in which many people of color still live today. And then one little last piece I'm going to speak to is the GI Bill of Rights that assisted veterans with housing, education, and jobs. And between 1944 and 1971, it spent $95 billion on benefits, but it was left to the states to administer. It all comes down to the implementation, right? And so as a result, Black veterans in the South were denied access. They couldn't get quality loans for housing or assistance with tuition, many of the things today that drives depth in communities of color. And there are many more events as to why we see the economic disparities that exist today, from the Civil Rights Act to the Jim Crow laws, but I'm going to end the history lesson there today because unfortunately, there are still some current practices and policies that are preserving the divide. And so there is a widespread misconception that the problem is based on the difference of income. But it's really much deeper than that when you look at wealth, which is the financial capital families need to expand their economic opportunity and agency. The disparity is even larger. So wealth is the value of all your assets owned minus your debt. And income reflects how much money you make each year. But if you spend more than what you make, whether or not if you have a higher income or low income, your wealth could literally be zero or even negative, meaning you are in debt. So this slideshow is from the U.S. Census Bureau in 2015, and it shows the median household wealth by income, quintile, and race. And I want to draw your attention to where all three races are at least making the lowest range considered for middle class. And you will see that the median wealth for African-American families was $49,500. For Latinos, is $45,720, compared to whites at $159,570. So we really truly have to consider the impact of wealth in that gap in families' ability to do more. Education is not the great equalizer. This is a myth, it's not the reality for communities of color. Instead, education is a tool to help families of color to advance out of poverty. It has not proven to be a wealth builder for communities of color. This chart, also from 2014, reveals that white households with a bachelor's degree are more than 3 times as wealthy as Black and Latino households with the same degree attainment. And it also shows that whites with a GED have a median household wealth of $64,200, which is double the wealth of that of a Latino and Black with a 4-year degree. And as stark as all these findings are, we have to remember that the racial wealth divide is not a natural phenomenon. It's the natural result of public policies throughout our history that have either been purposely or thoughtlessly designed to widen the economic gap between white households and households of color, as well as the wealthy and everyone else. And so if we're gonna be able to tackle this head on, we really need to figure out a way to leverage some existing policies and systems, from education to entrepreneurship, that can build up economic standing and wealth building potential for low wealth households, as well as creating new policies and systems to do the same. And on this last slide, before I began to talk about some key local data points I just want to lift up, these are just some current policies, from statement penalties for public assistance programs, the criminal justice program, systems role in financial security, as well as mortgage rate disparities, student debt crisis, the upside down tax code. You know, all these things are areas that we should be looking at to see how we can create some policies and practices that really just don't contribute to the divide that we see today. But now I'm going to move quickly into just some data points for the racial wealth divide in Minneapolis. This was a report that was released earlier this year. It was available in the meeting materials. We can also provide a link to it in the chat box, and it's also something that you can easily find on Prosperity Now website. One of the things that I want to say is that this report is not the know-how of everything. There is definitely things missing in this report, but it's really meant to be a conversation starter, a way for our partners on the ground to be able to hear the client stories, the lived experiences of folks with the data, depending on the audience that you're really working to inform. Is used to be an advocacy tool, a way to educate, a way to amplify the lived experiences, and a way to be able to really speak to the challenges that your services are addressing. So we see that the population is majority white, 60%, followed by Blacks at 19%, Latinx at 9%, Asian American at 6%, and Native American at 1%. We also see that households of color, the level of households of color is 65% that are in liquid asset poverty. And liquid asset poverty is the percentage of households that don't have 3 months of assets to survive in the absence of income, which is something that became a reality for far too many families during the pandemic. And so this number probably has increased. And I also just want to point out that Blacks do have the largest percentage of the liquid asset poverty rate at 71.1%, which is compared to 25.2% for whites. The data also show that the median household income for white residents in Minneapolis is 3 times more that than Native American and Black residents, and that Latinos are the largest group that are uninsured, another major factor during the COVID pandemic that was just a reality for too many families.
I'm
gonna ask that you please mute yourselves. Thank you. And across the country, many communities are experiencing historic levels of displacement due to gentrification. Homeownership and quality affordable rentals are essential tools for assessing and building financial well-being. Unfortunately, high rental and homeownership costs in the city are causing concern for many residents worried about displacement. For example, while close to 28% of Latinx households are homeowners, more than 40% are spending 30% or more of their income on housing. And at the same time, 60% of Black renters are spending more than 30% or more of their income for housing costs. So there's definitely some cost burden to consider. We also note that Black workers are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than white workers, and white residents are over 4 times as likely to have a bachelor's degree. And on average, white-owned businesses is almost 5 times the value of an average Black-owned business, and 5.6 times the value of a Native American business. So those are just a few key points. There's much more data that's available within the profiles. Again, they are available on our Prosperity Now website. We will also be sending them out again after the meeting. And as a reminder, these are the organizations that are part of our program that are working tirelessly to address some of the issues that I just lifted up. And now I'm gonna thank you all for listening to some of those key data points. I'm going to actually pass the mic over to Larry Posey, business advisor with Neon, but he's also part of the Building High Impact Nonprofits of Color project. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. And ironically, many of the points that I was going to make about framing this issue as we go into policy and advocacy as it relates to the wealth gap were already covered by Ebony, so I won't go there. What I will do is say that, you know, when we talk about how the FHA and the policies of the Homeowners Loan Corporation impacted people, I can only tell you that I grew up in a segregated suburb of Chicago, and I can remember that we were not allowed to move certain places or buy a home in certain places. And what I didn't know was that it was driven by the policies that Ebony outlined. So, you know, I didn't find this out till many years later that policy shapes our trajectory in life in many instances. So it's very important that nonprofits, especially nonprofits of color, are involved in policy advocacy. If we don't get involved in policy advocacy, we can help one person at a time. And that's what we do in my position is, you know, we work with one person at a time. But if we don't remove those obstacles that lie in front of them in the bigger sense, the inability to get access to capital because of certain discriminatory policies, the absence of investment in North Minneapolis and other places where you have large populations of people of color, then we can only do this much. When we start removing those obstacles by being involved and being at the table, then we have a chance to really work with people in a big way and create a big impact. So in this session, our nonprofit practitioners and policymakers are going to explore the challenges and discuss solutions for implementing effective policies aimed at shrinking the racial wealth gap in Minneapolis. The objectives of this session will be to showcase different perspectives and strategies to engage in policy and advocacy, lift up lessons learned, best practices, and current strategies that can be leveraged, and create a collaborative space for participants to understand how they can engage in advocacy and play a role furthering the policy solutions being put forth. And our moderator, who I'm proud to introduce, is Warren Mclean, will be Warren Mclean. He is currently the leader of Neon, Northside Economic Opportunity Network. He also previously led the Metropolitan Economic Development Association, MEDA, for almost 10 years. And before that, he worked with the CRF, the Community Reinvestment Fund in Minneapolis, for almost 15 years. And I can only tell you that I'm just absolutely proud to serve under him, and under his leadership, Neon has just grown dramatically. So I'm proud to introduce Warren Mclean.
Good afternoon. Larry, thank you so much for that introduction. I would just shift one thing. I was at MEDA before CRF, but thank you all. I'm delighted to be the moderator for this particular panel discussion. I have three highly esteemed panelists that'll be a part of that and will be responding to the questions that we pose. And I think you'll be excited about the things that they have to share, and you'll be energized by that. So we have three panelists this morning, and they are Paul Williams, Paul Williams, Alfredo Martel, and Senator Jeff Hayden. So let me provide introductions of the three of them. So starting with Paul, and Paul I've known for, well, a number of years. So Paul Williams is president and CEO of Project for Pride in Living, and one of Minnesota's premier multi-service community development organizations. PPL provides affordable housing to over 3,500 individuals and families on a nightly basis. They also deliver employment training and education to nearly 8,000 individuals annually. Paul has held various leadership roles in the Twin Cities, including serving as St. Paul's deputy mayor. He was also the executive director of Twin Cities List for a while, and then he served at the national level. He was senior vice president for field strategies for the national list. And Paul was recently named co-chair of Governor Walz's Economic Expansion Council. There are many more things that I could say about Paul, but you know that he's an august and a key leader in the Twin Cities. So welcome, Paul. Next, I'm going to go to my colleague here, Alfredo Martel. Alfredo and I served together on the Catalyst Coalition. Alfredo is the president and CEO of MEDA. He's been president for now about 2 years, but Alfredo has a very strong marketing background. He was formerly chief of marketing at for Strategy Communications. He was at the Walker Arts Center. He was chief marketing officer for Famous Dave's. He held several senior executive positions at Caribou Coffee. He was also the director of marketing for the Yums brands, which included KFC. He was also he's had extensive marketing experience. So I'll end with that. And then our Senator Jeff Hayden was state senator for serving 3 terms for at least 12 years. Prior to that, he was a representative and he served for 2 terms. So he's been a major leader in the legislature for about 16 years. And one of the things that Senator Hayden has done is he's authored important legislation. One of those was to increase the statewide minimum wage. He also advocated for an increased funding for the Child Care Assistance Program, and he passed a guaranteed school lunch program for all children, regardless of ability to pay. He authored the African American Family Preservation Act, which protects the best interest of African American children and promotes the stability and security of African American families. In 2015, he co-chaired the Select Committee on Disparities and Opportunities to find practical solutions to Minneapolis's racial disparities, which and also he created an appropriation that would, I think, created over $100 million for targeted investments in communities of color. So welcome our 3 esteemed panelists. The way I'll start is I'll ask you specific questions, and then after that, we'll ask questions that all of you can field. So Senator Hayden, we'll start with you. How does your work further influence state level legislation and regulatory activities?
Well, thank you so much, Warren, and it was good. And thank you for the Prosperity Now Coalition, the Catalyst Coalition, and all of the partners there. It's good to see you, Gary. Haven't seen you directly in a couple of years myself, so hopefully we can see each other. Warren, thanks for the question. As many of you know, I served in the legislature for over 12 years. I now serve as a government relations specialist for the firm of Frederickson and Byron. And so I've been fortunate enough to be able to work in the legislature to kind of help this issue, bring light to this issue, and put direct dollars in our community that targets African-American, BIPOC-led organizations, or organizations that primarily serve them. And then now as a government relations specialist or a lobbyist, I've been fortunate to have many of you as clients and to turn that opportunity to be the steward or the bridge from organizations that are working on these issues and connect them directly to government. So to your question, I think that it is twofold. We have to work on the policies that Ebony talked about extensively that really have put us in this situation. For instance, Reconnect Rondo is a client that I serve now, and that is the historic Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul that was devastated by putting a freeway in the middle of this historically Black, robust neighborhood to connect the 2 downtowns. So that was a public policy decision that said, we're going to put this road, this interstate, this happened all over the country, but to highlight it in this region, we're going to put it in, we've decided to put it here. We're going to take this Black community, separate it, take their houses, take their businesses away from them. And with that, not only did you break up the fabric of the community, but there's at least $150 to $200 million in equity that we can see on the back of the envelope that was lost because of that decision. Now we are now trying to restore that by starting to put a land bridge and restore what was taken and the dollars that it takes to do it. It's going to cost $500 million, and we're well on our way. However, what I want to highlight is the public policy decision that said that the freeway will go through that corridor, and that is in the Black community. So I think that from a legislative perspective, I mean, I'm interested to my co-panelists, we spend a lot of time talking about the money, which we should. That's what prosperity is. But we should also, as Ebony talked about, spend a lot of time talking about the policies that have created the destruction of our community, are the policies that continue to create the destruction or the lack of dollars in our community. I'll end this part with this. When we do a big project in the legislature in greater Minnesota or the suburbs, okay, if it's the Mall of America or the Viking Stadium or really big stuff, we get it done, we fight about it, and then we send the money out. When we have this conversation about creating those same opportunities in Black and Brown and Latino and Indigenous communities, it always comes up that we got to have guardrails. Now we got to make sure that the money is used properly. We got to put in layers and layers of, and you guys are dealing with that right now. Indeed, I'm dealing with it, trying to help money get out the door now. And now there's layers and layers and layers of regulations, to your point, Warren, that prevents us to be able to do it. So ultimately, you got to spend so much money administratively to get through that process that by the time you get the money, you can't do the work, or you got to go find another organization that maybe doesn't look like you, that has the capacity to fight through that. And for a fee, they will help you get through that process. And every dollar that they take, then that's money that doesn't go in the community. So I guess I'll just start out by being a little provocative, Warren, by saying that the public policy aspect of this is as important as the money.
And I couldn't agree more. So Paul, I'll direct this to you. So what is one of the signature policies or strategies your office is focused on connected to housing and business ownership?
Well, thanks, Warren, and great to see, as with Jeff, great to see a lot of old friends and friendly faces. Miss all of you dearly, and Jeff, thank you for your work on Reconnect Rondo. That, in fact, is my my hometown and my home neighborhood and community where I grew up with, and my family's been for decades. So literally, that is a personal connection for me, and really critical work. So there's a range of housing policies that we at PPL, we are first and foremost, we are doers, we are builders, we are trainers, we are educators. And so part of what we really do and really emphasize is we need to bring that on the ground experience to the policymaking table. I think everybody on this call knows that when we really truly bring the voice of the community to the policy table, it sounds different. And so that is part of what we try to bring, literally bringing some of our residents and creating kind of a community voice at those policy tables. You know, specifically in the housing arena, and again, you know, the housing coalitions and work that has gone on here for many years in Minnesota is actually fairly robust in terms of advocates and community organizations coming together to argue and really pitch much more robust funding for housing. And if you saw the article in the Star Tribune a couple of weeks ago, you know, it turns out that what we've known all along, Minnesota has one of the worst, if not the worst, housing crisis in the nation. And in fact, those policies that drive that, or really the lack of investment, the failure to keep pace with growth, not to mention just keep pace with the existing need, is something that we've been really focused on quite a bit. So the push for additional bonding to do more production, both for affordable housing, rental housing at the very lowest levels, as well as workforce housing, family of four earning $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 a year. That's us, right? That is us. And what we've seen this last year, I think to a T, is how critical housing is. Stable housing turns out is critical, right, to stable health. If you didn't have stable housing, you were at risk of catching this virus and potentially dying. Turns out housing is critical to healthcare, right, or to childcare, right? We're all taking care of kids from home now. Getting that childcare system back up to speed is critical. Housing is critical to employment and training. We're all training and education. We're educating our kids from home. So stable housing is really, really critical and has been kind of a bedrock issue, I think, for our community for many years. So that bonding funding is critical. Every couple of years when that comes up, there are land use policies, to Senator Hayden's point about how do we get not just at the funding, but what are the policies sitting behind these issues that are driving these inequities. And we're certainly active on a lot of those, both at the state level, but also at the regional level with the Metropolitan Council and local communities. Municipal government is where a lot of these zoning and land use issues are playing out, and they both continue to drive not only segregation, right? We talk a lot about concentrated poverty, but I would also actually argue that many of our policies are driving concentrations of wealth, right? Policies that keep wealth concentrated and don't let anybody else in. And those land use policies at the local, regional, and even at the state level are really critical issues that we've been weighing in on for really intensely in the last couple of years.
Great points all. So Alfredo, I'll direct this question to you. So what role belongs to nonprofits to inform these policies or strategies?
Got to make sure I don't make the rookie mistake of being muted. I guess I'm not. Okay, so hello, everybody. Great to be here and honored to be part of this panel. Well, first and foremost, I agree with everything that's been said. Informing and as frontline responders and operators, informing and educating is a big part of what our role is as nonprofits. I think that in the comments from Senator Hayden, I think that there's an opportunity for frontline operators like ourselves to bring real world to perceptions and biases, racism-based perceptions of risk, the demystifying of there's a lot of risk in this investment, there's a lot of risk in investing in this community. As people and as organizations that are in our communities, we can bring those results with real world rather than perceived biases, and show the return on investment, show what happens with a concerted, sustainable investment or support policies. The second is, and it's obvious through the Catalyst Coalition, which is, obviously NEON, LEDC, AEDS, CRF, and MEET are part of. Bringing a collective impact mindset has been really important to our coalition, and providing a collective and collaborative model to policy development rather than competitive fund development or fundraising has been a real game changer for our membership. And so it's a way to also demonstrate how we can collaborate and leverage each other as we try to advance and drive policy through the lens of what would be a maximum or most efficient collective impact is another important role. And I think finally, I would also say, because we are, again, closest to our communities, innovation for solutions. We talk about, we have to scale our solutions to the size of our problem. And the size of our problem is tremendously large. And so having that ability to innovate, create new instruments or new methods for addressing the issues of our communities is a responsibility of the nonprofit sector.
So Alfredo, I just want to let me pick up on the point you made. So what is Catalyst doing now? How is Catalyst, advancing this opportunity? You talked about the collective. So what is Catalyst doing now? What is on the table right now?
Well, I think that as we're, and this, but as we're concluding our strategic work, our strategic reset, we're looking at that collective impact mission. That was the foundation of the creation of the Catalyst Coalition. And so as we look at our membership and as we look at the services and the areas of focus of the mission statements of the member organizations, we're looking at how do we grow that collective impact? How do we maximize that, take it further? But a discrete, concrete example of action or a project or an initiative, a discrete initiative that pertains to supporting Black, Indigenous, person of color owned businesses is the creation of the Minnesota Inclusive Growth Fund with obviously the great support from the Minnesota Council of Foundations. We've stood up a fund, which is a off-balance sheet fund that will allow us to create really dramatic deployment of funds towards BIPOC entrepreneurship. And the member organizations, the lending organizations, will actually be able to have and support, or not support, but keep their liquidity more at bay. So by not having a requirement on net assets is an example of an innovation that allows for maximum deployment of capital to the mission that we pursue, but at the same time address one of the fundamental issues of many of the CDFIs, which is net asset requirements. So that's an example of innovation in the space with a lens to collectivism and collective impact.
Senator Hayden, I want to address this question to you. So what is one challenge you face in implementing a policy or strategy, and how is your office addressing this challenge?
Yeah, so, when I was, in office, I think I hit on that a little bit, is, often you'll see the legislature, appropriate dollars, get it through the whole process. Or, even now the governor has some ARPA funds and others that are a little fluid. But I think what we see is that once those dollars get appropriated, there is this arduous task of getting through the administration, either management and budget or deed or wherever the dollars stay. Even some of our friends who are doing community-based safety interruption, it's over at the Department of Public Safety. And then there's a whole set of rules that you have to go through in order to finally get that money into the door. And so some of that makes sense. You got to show your 990s and other things if you're kind of a newer, smaller organization, just to make sure you have a legal entity and all those kind of things. But others, I'll give you an example that we're hearing a lot about today is you got to do it on an invoice basis, right? So let's say you're a small organization, you don't have a lot of cash flow, so you got to go do the work, and then you got to invoice the state, and then they got to get through that bureaucracy, and then the state then pays you. Often there's a 2 to 3 month lag, so you got to have enough cash flow in order to get that work done. If you don't, then you kind of start to get into this pay for performance, and it just gets really murky. So, I often say that we are, or as I counsel now legislators who are in my position, and when I was there, and Senator Champion can tell you a lot about this, is how to write language that allows that money to get into your hands so that you can do the work, as opposed to feeling like you have, and if you're a larger organization, you may have that cash flow to be able to do that. But organizations that are near to the ground, a lot of the organizations that you guys talk about, the Catalyst Coalition, organizations and others, they need to get those dollars out and moving right as we speak and start to make that happen. The other thing I will say, and Paul talked a little bit about bonding, is that, and Warren, you and I had a conversation earlier today about bonding. Bonding is really complex, and I won't take you through all the ins and outs of it, but you gotta be able to, like, there is a process that says you guys want to build, want to invest in capital, got to have everything all together. The state comes in and either kind of closes the gap or it wants to see your plan in its totality before it's going to put its money in, versus what we tried to do and what I tried to do with Senator Champion is get money out the door to pay for things like site acquisition, to pay for things like architectural rendering, to pay for those kind of early upfront costs. It also sends a message to your funders, via that be philanthropic or business community or donors, that the state is in, and then often when we're in, everybody else will come in. So those are things that I hear from smaller BIPOC-led, Black, Indigenous, Latinx organizations, that as they're trying to grow and to expand, they're either caught in the administration or they don't have the resources that they need in order to put it together. And then I'll leave you with this: the money sits there, and those who do have that then come in and get the money. And good organizations that will serve a lot of people of color but aren't led by them, they do have that capacity and they come in and get it. So I don't want anybody who's listening who might work for one of those large organizations to think that I don't support them. I just got to be able to tell the truth, that those are the things that inhibit a lot of Black and Brown-led organizations to expand.
Well, Senator Hayden, you just pointed out a major issue, and we've spoken to some of the, I would say, the government officials. We pointed that out, that exactly the cash flow issue that you mentioned, it really challenges BIPOC-led organizations, and that is a frequent issue and needs to be addressed. So I thank you for highlighting that, and we're here to tell the truth. So thank you for lifting that up. So Paul, I want to address the next question to you. So how do we put power back in communities, in the hands of communities, organizations, and communities itself?
It's a great question. And boy, for many years I worked, actually, I spent the first third of my career in the foundation community, trying to chip away a little bit more of the funding rock for smaller BIPOC-led organizations, and saw, good work go on. But even in some of the cases where we were funding BIPOC-led organizations, we weren't necessarily always practicing true community engagement, right? Even within our own community, right? We were building models that reflected the mainstream social services, we're here to fix you model, as opposed to a model that truly engages community at its roots, a model that truly builds BIPOC voice and engagement. And so to me, and I've been saying this at PPL, really for the last 18 months, with the waves of various pandemics that we've been facing, not just COVID, but certainly, the murder of George Floyd, the political unrest, January 6th, right? Yeah. Wave after wave of pandemic that we've been facing. How we do the work matters as much as what the work is. How we rebuild in our communities is as important as what we rebuild. And the question is, in that rebuilding, will we in fact build and invest in, right, BIPOC-led organizations? Will we in fact create ownership opportunities along Lake Street, right, for BIPOC business owners? Will we in fact build capacity, the muscle, the abilities, right, to really do the work ourselves? I love what Reverend Sharpton said, right, at George Floyd's funeral. He said, if you would just take your knee off of our necks, we could get this done. And he's right. He's right on the money. If you would just take your knee off of our neck and let us get to it, we could get it done. And I fundamentally believe that. And I think American philanthropy, I think American governments, I think most governments across the world actually have not figured out how to do the work, how to invest in community, and to really truly to create community voice and community capacity. I will tell you that, this, the work going on at MEDA and LEDC, African Development Center, Neighborhood Development Center, work that Renee Dossman's doing over there these days. This is actually some of the best small business development work in the country. And so the issue isn't what's the incremental, right? If we give them another $25,000 or $50,000 grant, we need media to be 4 times, right? The size. We need ADC to be 4 times, right? With a whole different kind of structure, 10 times, Alfredo said, right? But this is what capacity looks like. This is what financial wherewithal and a balance sheet looks like. I love the concept of the Catalyst Fund, right? Allowing BIPOC organizations to work off of a common fund. But we need to accelerate and exponentially build that capacity. How we do the work matters as much as what work we do.
Absolutely. And so add me on.
If I can just double click
Go
on
ahead.
that, if I can double click on that just a little bit, because now you got me going. I totally agree. It's not just about getting the knee off our necks, but not being satisfied with microscopic organic growth. It's a time for disruptive, dramatic change. And we see the latest census. We see where the demography of this country's going. And frankly, it's an economic wealth problem, right? Economics. Corporate America also plays a role in here because they follow the market, right? The market forces are at bay for them. And when they see, well, a middle class in 20 years that won't be able to have disposable income to go shop at Target, bad news, really bad news, a bad trend. So it's a wake-up call in terms of course, the moment and the societal problems, but the economics of where we're headed as a country without dramatic disruptive growth, we're going into a really concerning economic, further concerning economic scenario if we don't take disruptive action. Yeah. So 4, love it. 10 for sure, better.
Senator Hayden, you want to weigh in?
Well, I think that these gentlemen have really articulated that, but I will say that, the way that Paul and Alfredo talk about it, I think are important, but I think that the intentionality of this in almost activist-like, even from, the STEAM panel and the business community, just to use the demographics and then say that that's going to force people to change their behavior. I don't think that works. Like, it just doesn't seem to work. When I started the legislature, can't think of his name, but he's our state demographics. I just lost it. But he said 15 years ago that we're getting grayer and browner. Never forgot it. You know what I mean? That's rung in my head. And that's kind of how I led and worked on this. But still today, right now today, I'm going to the legislature with a group of clients, like fighting what seems like for scraps of the state budget, right? For scraps of the state budget, even though all the things that Paul and Alfredo said, even in a post-George Floyd world, right? All those things we have a $54 billion biennial budget that is now being supplemented by $2 to $3 billion of ARPA money. We have a K-shaped economy, one of the most robust professional regions in the country. We have a $2 billion, almost $3 billion surplus of state general fund. That's not to say all the money that's coming in from the federal government that we kind of watch and pay attention to. So we have all this going, and many of you guys are my clients, or certainly almost all of you are, because even if you're not directly, I work for your coalitions, and I understand the process, have personal relationships with all the leaders, and it is often sometimes that I'm begging them to just give us a few of the extra dollars in order to put in the system to do the great work that we all know that you're doing. So there's going to have to be really a force. There's going to have to be the idea that I love my friends on the progressive side. They have the great ideas, right? I love folks that are talking about very practical things in the community, but those forces and others are going to have to come together with our allies and really push this issue to move. And I'm just going to speak, corporate America, you guys can talk about philanthropy. You guys can talk about, I haven't really worked a lot in either but I have worked in government most of my life, and I know that we have the dollars, we have the ability. What we don't have is the will, and the way that the legislature gets the will is through politics. It's through voting. It's through making sure your voice is heard, and it is through taking a risk to say that if you're not doing the things that I want, I got to find somebody who has. We have the money. We just don't have the political will.
I think that's well said. So, Paul, I'm going to ask you, how do we get the political will? What do we need to do to change behavior?
Well, that, as Jeff said, that's the $53 billion question. It certainly does come through political action, and as I said earlier, community voice. And I actually think the two of those are a little bit different. They're absolutely connected. And I see in particular, for example, in East African Somali communities, a fair amount of organization going on around political activism. And again, this is a little bit outside of my bailiwick. I certainly would defer to Jeff and others on this, but I do think it is fundamentally about organizing and about getting active and getting down to the Capitol and getting people into elected office in a wholesale, kind of much more aggressive way, and getting to the table and not being on the menu, but being at the table. I think is certainly part of that, and political action is absolutely part of that. For us, a big piece of what we do, and again, we live in the world of those 3,500 folks that live with me every night. 70% of them are Black. Got a big contingent of Somali residents who live with us, and they're struggling and resourceful and battling every day. And so part of our charge that we have added alongside of kind of our supportive services is a very intentional approach to voice. Get active in your neighborhood, on your block, and civic engagement, of civic involvement, for us, absolutely, I think, is at the heart of what Jeff's talking about, of how we start to build voice, build a presence, build political power. And that's not easy. I don't again, finding the funding and the wherewithal to do that intentionally. There's a lot of good advocacy organizations around. I don't know that there are a lot of intentional, kind of voting and political action groups rooted in the African American community, for example. And that may be, a route that we need to be much more intentional about. Tough question.
Alfredo, how do we get the corporate community involved? I mean, they built the stadium, so how do we get them involved? How do we get them to how do we change the political will there?
Well, again, corporations respond to the market forces, right? And when we start to demonstrate what's being left behind in terms of the cost to our gross national product of all these inefficiencies and basically racist-based systems, when you calibrate GNP to, like, there's 4 points of GNP that it's not there just based on bad economic policy. And then we look at how do we compete with China? How do we compete with other countries? And we have right here at home built-in inequalities, built-in inefficiencies to our productive power. That's one conversation, right? That's the market, that's Wall Street, that's high level. But when we start to look at consumers and who is going to start to, and full disclosure, you said it, I'm a marketer by former trade. So when we see the customer is changing and the economic capacity of your customer is being diminished by all of these economic forces, gaps, inequalities, a corporation that's in retail, a corporation that's interested in selling a product or a service must take note. And so for me, I almost wanted to, following Paul, I wanted to almost coin the phrase like economic activism, It's like if you start to generate not just an awareness, but how do we engage in solutions that will address these terrible market forces that are operating inside of our economy, and we eradicate them, there's actually growth for the entire economic system. So if you want to compete against China at the global scale, fix what's going on in our economic system, these biases and economic inequalities. That gets you right there some real interesting boost that will be game changing in the global scale. So I don't know, broad, but certainly from what we see, again, disruptive, game changing, and hopefully sustainable in the long term rather than a corporate attention or corporate focus on a moment. You all know meat has been around for 50 years. We don't talk about moments. We talk about long term. So hopefully that helps.
It does help. So let me ask you about a couple of projects that are coming down the pipe here that are pretty immediate. So we've got two major projects that are on the table. We got light rail coming into North Minneapolis. And we want to make sure that that project garners the resources and that the North Minneapolis community really benefits from Black and brown businesses really benefit from what's happening there. So how do we ensure that? How do we make sure that happens? How do we make sure? And I want to use this example that happened in St. Paul. So when light rail was extended in St. Paul, there was litigation that was instituted to make sure that 3 stops were added that would actually that were positioned so that the community made resources such that the stops were helpful for the community. And those stops initially were not there. And so the engineers had developed the light rail line so that excluded a lot of stops that were important for the community. So how do we take action in a similar vein? And does that need to be, do we need to apply that to both light rail in North Minneapolis and the Upper Harbor Terminal that's coming in North Minneapolis? And so maybe Senator Hayden, I'll start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think you're right. I mean, I think you've articulated that, we know through the line that went through St. Paul, that one, you got to put in goals to minority, hiring participation goals. And that goes everything from the professional side, architectural, engineering, all the way to the folks that are going to be digging, and hammering the holes, right? They're going to be digging the dirt out. And so want to make sure that we lift that up. I don't think that the professional side gets talked about enough. We also have to figure out what do we do with the lack of revenue or potential displacement of businesses. I think that was a large kind of conversation that went along University Avenue, especially, businesses of color, restaurants, and others. And then I think you have to start to figure out what is your overall plan. I mean, light rail on its face moves people from one part of the region to the other. But what it also does is it's a major economic development tool. It attracts, if you think about the Hiawatha corridor, even the University corridor, it attracts developers for people who want to live there, people who want to walk and ride and get out of their cars, and has a major environmental impact. And people want to live close to the train in the way that the system is set, that you get on one train, you can get just about, we're getting out there. We're going to be as far as Eden Prairie, the airport, downtown St. Paul, right now, all the way out to Brooklyn Park. So you'll be able to traverse the region pretty easily when this system is fully built out. So as you think about development and housing development, we talked a little bit about that. How do you do that in a way that you don't gentrify and it's just all market rate housing, or it's all housing that a lot of the people in our community can't afford? How do you make that something that they can afford? And then for those that are developers and aspiring developers, how do we ensure? I think about my brother, Tim Baylor, who is a developer, has developed a lot and is doing work on West Broadway now. How do we get more Tim Baylors to participate in the economics of it. And so some of that can easily be done by putting in mandates. We did it for the stadium and others at the legislature as a matter of when we appropriate the dollars as they come through. Some of it has to be an intentional strategy, for the city and for those that set the regulation. And then there is going to have to be this idea that philanthropy and business have to really get in and lean in and really look at our communities as being really a part of the revenue that's going to be generated from that. And they're going to have to make good on their promises after George Floyd was murdered and really capitalize these organizations like your own, who then turn around and capitalize, in your businesses, entrepreneurs, and others. So we know what to do. We know how it works. But this gets back to that will and then that collaboration along the system to ensure that we have a robust community in North Minneapolis. Because if you don't do that and you kind of sit back and we don't kind of get ready for it, and I think, Warren, this is where you were leading, it'll get gentrified, and then, North Minneapolis will look just like the North Loop, right? And I spent some time in the North Loop and I like it over there, but I don't see a lot of Black-led organizations or businesses that are in the North Loop. Now, I'm probably getting myself in trouble as a GR professional here by going after folks, but I'm just trying to once again give you a sense that the prosperity that we see in downtown East, where I live now, or the North Loop, we should be able to get that in North Minneapolis with people who look like us.
Paul and Alfredo, you want to weigh in? Paul?
Yeah, I would just tag on to that. Jeff raised a bunch of really important points there, and I happened to be deputy mayor in St. Paul when they were constructing the light rail line. I picked the wrong 3 years to be deputy mayor, right, during construction, and then I left before they cut the ribbon, so I didn't even get invited to the ribbon cutting. But it's a fabulous example of a massive infrastructure investment, and again, how you do the work matters as much as what the work is. And I actually would argue, and again, man, there was a lot of heavy lifting in the community. I would argue that the advocates and the neighborhood activists, Aurora St. Anthony, Frogtown Neighborhood Association, some folks who had capacity. And when I was at LISC, we had started to seed those organizers, and they were part of the voice that rose up and were pushing some of that legal activity that led to the addition of those 3 lines, or the 3 stops, which was absolutely critical, as Jeff said. But the Central Corridor Funders Collaborative was formed, multiple foundations as well as national foundations, folks at Living Cities who invested heavily in that collaborative, which was looking specifically at how do we ensure development beyond the rail? Who's at the table? To what extent is community involved in this? Neighborhood Development Center, Tamale and lots of other folks were really active. We created a loan fund to help existing entrepreneurs of color buy their buildings so that they were in an ownership position once the rail came through. A ton of joint marketing work went on to help businesses survive the construction period. A lot of intentionality around thoughtfulness in terms of design, greening the trench so it wasn't just a rail going through the neighborhood. A lot of really good work going on there. To Jeff's point, I don't know that I have seen that kind of intentionality along that next line coming through, and that line has even more economic potential, right? Because there's just flat out more value along the line already, right? In terms of higher value neighborhoods. And so the gentrification risks, I think, and just look and see who's tying up property already. And what is that process looking like? I think that I'll get myself in trouble right alongside you, Jeff. I'm concerned about that along that next light rail line. But some really good work went on in St. Paul. It was far from perfect and certainly could poke holes in it, but it was a great example of intentionality and an upping of the game, both from the participation goals that Jeff talked about, as well as kind of the community engagement, community involvement, community investment side of things.
Yeah, this
Alfredo.
topic just briefly brings up, for example, a very tangible pivot to our operation, right? It's like commercial real estate. And how do we get our clients to move from being building tenants to being building owners, right? So that's something that we as a CDFI and as a consultant to our clients are starting to look at as a result of everything that's going on in the various corridors. We're starting to think about how do we generate more activity and focus into providing those kinds of solutions so that we avoid gentrification, right? And on a personal note, I think that, being intentional about sustaining the diversity, the cultural, ethnic, community diversity of our city adds value to the city. And so losing that, right, if everything, and it's not because I was a CMO of Caribou, but if everything just becomes a Starbucks, we lose who we are. We lose our identity, and we basically have lost value, cultural value to our community. So that is an example, that topic is an example of how we as an operator have shifted our solutions to address a community need.
So Ebony's kind of telling me that we have time for questions. So we want to field questions from the audience. So how do you want to handle this? People maybe want to raise their hands or put questions in the chat, and our panel will take those questions.
They can raise hand or they can put it in the chat. But we have 10 minutes left for that. So if you have any questions, please send them to our panelists or raise your hand. I do have one question. We've been discussing a lot around how to build political power, civic engagement, community voice. What are your guys' strategies around how to do that across Black and Brown groups, to be able to have that more collective strategy where it's not, a competition over what issues are, the most apparent to address, but how there's a lot of similarities around the issues and the benefit of having the collective power and voice across ethnicities.
Yeah, I'll just start. That's a great question. I often call it the race to the bottom, right? Like everybody on the idea that we're all kind of fighting against each other. We put a little pool of money out here and we all kind of fight, with each other to kind of carve it up. And it's a distraction, right? So if we put, work I've done, $35 million a year, last 4 or 5 years, $100 million that directly, went into, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Hmong communities. Sounds like a lot of money. I'm very proud of it, but it's $100 million over the last 3 bienniums, and there was $150 billion that was spent over the last 3 bienniums, right? And so then we kind of fight over that, which, it's money, it's significant, but we kind of missed the boat. So I do think that there has to be kind of a reckoning that I'm afraid isn't where I think it needs to be, that starts to see the common interest in communities and how they work together to kind of move the agenda. Otherwise, I think what you see is a further splintering of ethnicities to only go it alone. My good friend Paul and Alfredo are not part of that coalition. They're actually bringing people together, Warren as well, to try to bring that together. But there are forces there that really kind of depend on us being after each other in a way for them to be the old-fashioned divide and conquer. And if you're at each other's throat and you keep your eye off the ball, you fight over crumbs, and then the big pieces of revenue that go out the door kind of go to the traditional sources. So it's something I don't quite have an answer for, and I've been working on a long time, but it is something that is the elephant, if you will, in the room in our communities, notwithstanding the folks on the panel and others here that are trying to work together.
I was just going to chime in just with a couple examples. I think Jeff is right. I mean, much more often than not, we are kind of at, fighting over bits and pieces, crumbs, literally, in the larger context of things. A couple of cross-cultural collaborative efforts that I'm aware of that I've really been impressed with. One, I see Gary Cunningham on here. Gary's one of the founders of our African American Leadership Forum, ALF, which is a leadership network of leaders across kind of generations and sectors in the African American community. There are three other cultural networks that grew out of that same model. The Coalition of Asian American Leaders, CAL, Bo Tao is over there, Tawahe Foundation in the Native American community, and Latino Lead. And those four cultural organizations in the last couple of years, Bigelow Foundation made some big investments in them to work collaboratively. And again, tip of the iceberg, I'm sure that they're scratching, but I've been impressed with some of the work that they have done collectively in trying to kind of get to that more cross-cultural conversation. There's also, and I don't know the name of the group, but Clues, American Indian OIC, a number of the culturally based workforce organizations came together in the last couple of years to push back pretty significantly on some efforts to kind of go after culturally specific funding. Jeff, probably that funding that was contained in that pool, in those pools that you had put together, and they were quite effective in making their case for the importance of that culturally specific racial equity funding to their work, and pushed back, I think, pretty effectively. So a couple of good examples of cross-cultural collaboration. Again, in the larger scheme of things, we need to be taking that to a whole nother level, I think.
I don't think I can add anything other than what I'm reading right now in a connected social media, completely full public environment of our current society. I'm reading this book right now called New Power. So here, I'm just pining for a book. It's quite interesting how when I was 30 years old, the world and political and social power operated in a certain way, very hierarchical, command and control. And the new way the world is operating through connected networks, and we're all reading everything that's going on with Facebook these days, it's an interesting read right now. And we were talking about getting collectivism, getting political power, getting mobilization. It's an interesting read. So there you go, a book.
There's a question in the chat. It says, from Kimberly Jones, it says, we know that gentrification for decades have plagued Black and brown neighborhoods. How can we create gatekeepers so that our community might benefit as opposed to being left out of the process?
I would just say the earlier question about how do we build power and how do we demand and create a space at the table is part of creating that gatekeeper function. I don't know that somehow legislating it or appointing it, I mean, those can be helpful in pushing back against gentrification. I have to tell you that and again, I've been a little bit outspoken over the years around this question of gentrification. And for myself, having worked when I worked for LISC nationally, I worked in some of the toughest neighborhoods across the country in the greatest cities of America, literally from coast to coast. And those communities, gentrification is really, displacement is what we need to work against. Gentrification, I don't know what gentrification is, but I prefer to work in communities that have some value, that are rising. And again, we want to prevent displacement. But I've worked in neighborhoods where there is no value and where everything we have to go get is 100% subsidy. And we have no ability to bring people in, to draw people in. I think there's something about the market, a market that is community and culturally based is something that that's what I'm trying to get after. In my historic community of Rondo, there's value there, right? My grandfather was a Black dentist in Rondo, and there were Black professionals in Rondo. There was value there. My family owned their real estate in Rondo. There's something to that, and pushing back against displacement and not allowing people to be there or want to come there. I don't know, that's a complicated answer, but I really, to me, that's important.
Yeah, no, but to your point, the data that Ebony shared at the beginning, when it was talking about renters and owners that are cost burden, the tipping point for displacement is so so low, right? It's borderline no effort to create that displacement. So addressing that, was an eye opener in terms of the data that was shown at the beginning of the panel. So yes, it's quite just a gentle nudge, and you can eradicate neighborhoods because of that cost burden level that we saw in that data.
Okay.
Well, and I will also say that some of this stuff, Warren, I'll just leave you with this, has been latent in under, like, for instance, when the tornado came through 6-7 years ago through North Minneapolis, it was enlightening that, number one, high 60-70% of folks were renters in houses, and a good portion of those folks were on public assistance, right? It was there, nobody was talking about it, but it wasn't until the destruction came and we went in to try to figure out how to help people that we were finding out, if we were trying to help people figure out what they had insurance or what they needed, that they didn't own the property. Somebody else outside of the community owned the property, or when we were trying to give them direct financial assistance, we were running against government regulations because a lot of those people were on some sort of public assistance, right? And so I heard a number, 70% of North Minneapolis is rental, even though, it's not multifamily housing. I mean, there's some multifamily housing. There's a lot of just single family houses that they don't own. So I'm sure that there's really smart people can start to figure out how do we start to buy those again, as Paul said, and get them back into people's hands and communities, and try to get home ownership and lift home ownership. We haven't talked a lot about that here. But what we do know is that you go in these communities, the people there are the commodities, right? Alberto talked a lot about corporations and marketing, and they're just the commodities, and somebody outside of the community is making a ton of money off them, even though they're not reinvesting that back in the community. So people living in substandard environments on economic or some sort of government assistance, but somebody else owns that and is benefiting from, largely. I used to run a Section 8 program. I can tell you how many checks I sent out of state to landlords who were for people who were renting in state. So I know that's a bit of a rant, but I think we got to really also get real and talk about what is going on today. Not even before we even worry about what could happen in the future. We may already be gentrified and don't know it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'm going to pause here and let maybe Vanna come in and talk about how we take action. So Vanna, do you want to instruct the team here?
Sure. And Warren, if you'll tee up the asset that, was suggested, and I'll go into how to actually take action.
So one of the things that we want to do is this is advocacy and policy. So we want to make sure that we don't just leave this with conversation, that as a result of this, that people either reach out to their legislators and leaders so that they will indicate what kind of action needs to be taken. And so what we've done here is we've put together not a poll, actually a facility that allows you to contact your legislator with specific asks on how you think resources should be allocated or what should be done in the communities that we've discussed today.
Thank you for that, Warren. And I know that we had discussed, some of the ARPA funding, the additional ARPA funding that's going to be coming to Minnesota. And so with that, you'll see there dropped in the chat, there's a link for folks to take action. As Warren mentioned, we thought that at the conclusion of this policy and advocacy session, that we don't just leave it in talking about taking action, but there's an opportunity to actually do something. So through clicking the link, you'll see an action alert that we built out on our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center with a little bit of descriptive text on what's happening with those ARPA dollars in Minnesota. And there's a section for you to send an email to your state legislators and to the governor there in Minnesota. In order to do so, you just need to put your name, address, so that we can locate your legislator in the system. Once you click, I believe it's submit at the bottom there, you'll see an email template. Your name should already auto-populate. I think a first line should auto-populate with your legislator's name in it. But take a moment to send an email to your legislators and tell them how to spend that additional ARPA funding that's going to be coming into Minnesota. So, and feel free to share this link. We've got it here for you all to take action on this call, but also feel free to share it with your networks as well.
So I want to thank all the panelists, Jeff, Alfredo, and Paul. This has been an outstanding discussion, very provocative. Thank you for your leadership. And we look forward to hearing from you as we go forward in the future. And thank you for all the ideas that you presented. Thank you for the audience. Thank you to all of you who have listened in. We just appreciate your engagement and looking forward to, I guess, the remaining panels.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was a great panel, and I think it's a perfect setup for our next discussion, which is around how to connect the equitable funding and the impact investing to this conversation. And there was a lot of conversation around that. And so I'm just gonna tee us up for that next panel. And so the funding ecosystem in the city over the last year has looked drastically different from years past. There has definitely been an increase in funding, especially to BIPOC-led organizations during the COVID crisis and as a result of the civil unrest in the city that has allowed many organizations to deepen their impact in the communities that they're serving. But how do we really help to ensure that these changes that we saw in this space continue to support these organizations beyond the crisis? So how can we get to a point where, I believe it was, trying to think of who said it, but, connecting the needs, the solutions to the issues that folks are addressing. And so we have a panel discussion that's gonna really try to highlight some of those strategies, some of those assets that can be leveraged, and really try to figure out how we can get more resources into these nonprofits that are really close to the communities, they're from the community, they have the trust with the community. And for those reasons, we feel like they are uniquely positioned to serve the community. The panelists will explore some different funding structures and ways to streamline application processes, for example. They're going to discuss some impact investing opportunities, highlight some of the ways in which they are looking at how they are functioning internally to be able to hold themselves accountable for how they're being more rooted in equity around how they're investing in organizations and communities of color. And we're also going to just discuss, like, how do you have some of those challenge kind of type of conversations? How do you make sure the community is part of the process and really being able to make it a collective effort? Many of the things that we heard come out of the previous conversation. And so we are gonna move into a discussion that will be moderated by Susan Hamill at Cogent Consulting. And she's gonna tell a little bit more about the panelists, but I'm proud to be able to have Jackie Staten Allen, Grantmaker Director for the Bush Foundation, and Shauna Smith Baker, Chief Impact Officer at the Minneapolis Foundation, to partake in a conversation around some of these challenges, as well as just a lot of solutions and areas of opportunities to be leveraged. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Susan. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ebony. was really inspired by the kickoff this morning and the words from your amazing panelists earlier today. And I'm just giddy to be on the same virtual stage with Jackie and Shonda, who I've admired from afar for many, many years. And I guess I'll have to continue to admire you through Zoom, but hopefully in person one day soon. My name is Susan Hamill, and as Ebony said, I'm the founder and president of Cogent Consulting. We are a woman-owned financial advisory firm, and I mention that because there aren't too many women-owned financial advisory firms in the entire country. We're a public benefit corporation. We help people do good well, or as I sometimes say, don't do good stupid. So hopefully we're going to get into a lot of these ways to do good well here in the next hour or so. We work with foundations of all sizes, types across the country. We work a lot in Minnesota and North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, kind of Midwestern region, but also on the coasts. I also serve as executive in residence for the Minnesota Council on Foundations, where I am on call to Jackie and Shonda as a member benefit to the 150 members of the Minnesota Council. So over the last 2 years, I think we've all had a giant wake-up call. Of course, this is a long time coming to talk about the racial wealth divide and get working on it. If you weren't part of the earlier conversation when Ebony gave a presentation on the history of why we have these disparities and this racial wealth divide going back to history, one of the stats she threw out there was that in the home mortgage loan program, which was a huge government benefit in the 30s, only 2% of the home mortgages went to people of color. So I highly encourage you to get a copy of her slides and look through those stats. And particularly for me, a native Minnesotan, reading the Prosperity Now report on Minneapolis is sobering, but also a real call to action. But over the last 2 years, COVID exposed these huge inequities like nothing before. Then when George Floyd was murdered here, that really exposed that kind of Minnesota nice, if you will, or Minnesota progressiveness, that it just isn't cutting it. And we have to change and transform. And some of the earlier speakers talked about the need, I think Alfredo and Paul Williams spoke about the need for true transformation. I don't know if they used the word revolution, but it was pretty close. So that's what we're going to talk about today with Jackie and Shonda is how philanthropy is changing. What I'm seeing around the country is that foundations are open to change. There is a moment where they are looking, they're seeking solutions. And, you know, all types of foundations, corporate, like don't forget the corporate foundations. They're kind of desperate to look for ways to change. But private foundations, big, small, family foundations, community foundations. And there are two issues they're looking at, and that's place and race. And they're just eager for solutions. And that's what a lot of you, a lot of the nonprofits and a lot of the leaders on this call know the most about. You're the experts in. So Paul Williams from Project for Pride in Living, he talked about how you are the doers. And I think it's an exciting time. So I'm going to, in just a minute, ask the panelists, Jackie Statham Allen and Shonda Smith Baker, to briefly introduce themselves. And our topic for this next period of time is we're going to have a conversation about how they and their organizations are moving from transactional funding relationships to transformational relationships, because that's what's needed. That's what this moment calls for. So before I turn it over, I'll just go in alphabetical order here and pick on Shonda first to introduce yourself, and then Jackie. But if you can, if we were all in person, we'd be able to see your wonderful faces. I know sometimes bandwidth and children and dogs and spouses are in the picture. So I understand if you can't turn your picture on, but if you can, it's nice for those of us who are speaking to see who we're speaking to. Also, if you would like to take a moment and rename yourself with, you can put your name and then the organization you're with by kind of hovering over your picture and clicking on the 3 dots. That might be helpful to build a sense of Zoom community. I will try to monitor the chat. I think Ebony has some time reserved for questions, but I will, if you have a question for the panelists, I will do my best as moderator to monitor that. And I do have a bunch of questions that Ebony helped us with. So we're ready to go, but I welcome your questions as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Shonda, to do your intro.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm Shonda Smith-Baker. I'm the Chief Impact Officer and Senior Vice President at the Minneapolis Foundation, where I've been for the last 4 years. Prior to that, I led at Pillsbury United Communities the last 7 as President and CEO. I am a native to Minneapolis and live on the north side.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Statham Allen, and I'm a grant-making director at the Bush Foundation. The region of the Bush Foundation is Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and the 23 Native nations that share that same geography. As a grant-making director, I have the opportunity to work on a lot of issues, and over the past year, one of those has been on racial wealth disparities. I also spend a lot of my time working on education issues. I've been at the Bush Foundation for about 3 years, and before that, I was at St. Paul Public Schools for about 7, working on strategy and policy, legislative issues, and then Chicago Public Schools before that. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Shonda and Jackie. You both have amazing backgrounds, and I appreciate you keeping it brief, but just a hats off to you for your tremendous expertise that you're bringing to this work. So the first question for both of you, and maybe I'll do reverse order, start with Jackie, is, how has your organization's investment in racial wealth inequality, how has that changed how you actually do your work internally? So over to you, Jackie.
Yeah, I think that first I'll describe what we've been doing in racial wealth disparities and our work at the foundation. Last March, the foundation announced that we were committing $100 million to seed 2 community trust funds to address racial wealth disparities in Black and Native American communities in our region. And the way that we were doing that work is through grants to individuals to work on things, to invest in things such as home ownership, education, small business development. And the reason that we decided to focus on individuals is because wealth is generational. And so often the wealth that a family or individual does or does not have is directly tied to the wealth that was generated by the family before them that was passed down or wasn't passed down. And that so much of that, nearly all of that, has to do with race-based US policy of the past that has really disadvantaged communities of color and Indigenous communities. And here for our initiative, we're focusing on individuals from Black communities and Native American communities in our region. And the way that we're going about that is that we are selecting 2 steward organizations that are going to receive those funds, $50 million for Black, $50 million for Native American communities, and design grant programs and run those grant programs. And so this is a really big undertaking for the Bush Foundation. This is the largest initiative dollar-wise that we've ever done. And it's a very different initiative than what we've done in the past for 2 ways, in that it's focused on eventually these grants will go to individuals, and that the Bush Foundation is not going to run these programs. This is absolutely exercise in power sharing, and that we are choosing steward organizations that are so much closer to the communities and have so much more 2-way trust with communities than the foundation does in order to run those programs. And so I think that one of the ways in which this effort has changed our the way that we do our work in our foundation is that issue of power sharing and ways in which we can get out of the way so that community-based organizations that have so much more experience and relationships and engagement and histories in the communities that we want to serve, how can we, create opportunities so that it is those community-based organizations that are doing the work. And I think another way in which it has changed our work is that as we were developing this program with these community trust funds, was that we also learned, we knew, but also heard that there are so many systems issues that even as we are able to address and start building generational wealth, individuals, families, one at a time, that there are so many opportunities for systems level change across communities to address racial wealth gaps, not only in Black and Native American communities, but other communities of color as well. And so we also committed an additional $50 million over the next 5 years to work on, in our more traditional grant making sorts of ways of addressing those systemic issues around racial wealth disparities. I'll pass it to Shonda now.
Yeah, for the Minneapolis Foundation, or let me say, I've thought about this question and I prefer to sort of swap it, if you don't mind, and talk about how the internal work and our ability to recognize system inequities have changed the way that we fund it. And we've been on an arc at the Minneapolis Foundation. And when I arrived about 4 years ago, we were sunsetting a grant or a strategic plan that really focused on raising dollars. We're a community foundation. We function very differently than the Bush Foundation. So we have donor advised funds. It was very much about how do we grow the number of donor advised funds that we have, get more money in community, and it was very donor centric. So we spent a couple of years really focused on our why and what we need to think about, how we need to do work differently. And we really sort of battled it out internally in terms of our practice. What did we need to examine and how do we need to transform ourselves? And so our value statements, and I'll share a couple with you: change is personal, internal mirrors that desired external, equity is a responsibility, proximity is necessary, civic participation is powerful, and hope is essential. And I think in the examination of those things and what did they mean from us from our various seats, we had a different conversation around the inequities that were happening in community. And what did it mean? And what does it mean for the Minneapolis Foundation to operate in its whole self in relationship with community? And who was determining where we go in terms of funding and how we did that funding? And so that's been a big element of our work, is really focusing on the how. Because as we looked at the how and we understood the barriers that we had to being accessible to community, it changed the what. And it allowed for us to go deeper in areas that we need to go deeper in, including how we leveraged our leadership, how we supported and amplified the voices of others that lived in community, how we embedded, included, invited experts from community into how we did our work. And so that's really been the journey that we've been on. We've always funded in this space, but I think, Susan, to your point, it was transactional. It was, we have the dollars, you write for the dollars, we give them to you, maybe, if you meet our criteria. And I think that the wealth building strategies, there's an economic development portfolio that we fund in, that's more explicit, and we can talk about some of those efforts. But I think the other piece really feeds into the conversation earlier of folks that live in community, that have expertise, that have been contributing to this community, whether or not it's been as a basketball coach or a youth minister, or just an outstanding neighbor that is caring beyond their own home. How do we invite people that have not been involved in formal philanthropy in, And how do we make sure that we're actually going and looking for them and not expecting just for the people that already know how to navigate philanthropy, the application process, they have the relationships and the confidence that they will be successful. That's one group of people, but how can we actually go out to folks that don't think that philanthropy is for them, that their ideas won't get funded, that it's not accessible? That is the work for us to continue to do that, build confidence, build relationships, and to knit together the power that exists within community.
Thank you so much, Shonda. You're echoing so much of what I heard earlier today about change and wisdom and power. The next set of questions from Ebony, and also I see in the chat, have to do with accountability. So the question has to do with foundations have these goals and about racial equity. Where is the accountability? What kind of accountability measures are grounded into some of the work you're doing? And then there's a question in the chat kind of about scale, if I can paraphrase. But first, before we get to that question, let's talk about accountability measures that you are seeing either at your foundation, for yourself, for your team, or that you're seeing that you feel comfortable talking about in other organizations as well. So Jackie, I see you nodding your head. Would you like to kind of kick us off on this, or should I bounce that one over to Shonda?
I could kick it off. I can try.
Yeah.
So with accountability measures, actually the Bush Foundation, we are working on a public scorecard in order to share information about the type of grant making that we do, for it to be a tool for grantees and potential grantees and community members in general about the work that we're doing, and for the issue of racial equity. That is a priority area of ours for across the foundation, and in particular with our core grant making program, Community Innovation, which is an open program that most of our grantees go through. There is an opportunity for us to flag and code those grant awards that address racial equity in some sort of way. And I think that also where we're going with accountability as well, and evaluation and learning, is that we also want to make sure that we are supporting our grantees and them learning what they want to learn. So when we look at evaluation, rather than the foundation saying, well, we want to know X, Y, and Z about this grant, instead, we provide that grantee with evaluation dollars. And then they say, well, in order for us to do this work in the way that we want to do it and serve our community well, we need to know A, B, and C. And so they set up what those important measures are for learning. And in partnership, the foundation works with them and we learn together. So I think that that's an important part of accountability, that who owns the data and for whom is the data even being collected and decided. And we think that in order to have really effective programming and these grants that are meant to support that programming, that it should be that community-based organization that is actually owning the data and deciding what's going to be measured.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for us at the Minneapolis Foundation, there's not a one-way approach because we have multiple ways that we invest in community. So for small grants, I honestly don't ask for final reports. I ask that our grantees share with us the information that they think is important for us to continue to learn and grow with them on how the work went. In other cases, we will ask, and on our annual grant rounds, we have it where grantees determine with us what they want to report back on. So we do that in relationship with that portfolio. But I do think that where Jackie was going is that this is another place where inequities exist. Particularly, I see in community foundation where there's, millions of dollars going to an art institute and no one ever asks a question about, are you moving a needle? Is the dollars well spent? And then we put $15,000 or $20,000 out to a nonprofit and we see the evidence of their work demonstrated and communicated by community. And we ask them to spend hours of time filling out a report. So I am very cognizant of that and try to weigh that. And I think doing that in relationship, in a partnership, matters quite a bit. And so I'm one that pushes back on this move the needle report back to really pointing out the inequities on how we determine what is a quality organization and what's not, who gets to determine that, who gets to determine impact. And I think we're in a stage now where we're asking those questions. And we are very thoughtful about evaluation measures and working now with groups to figure out how we can be the most innovative in the way that we do that, in a way that respects community, in a way that informs, to Jackie's point, and becomes a tool for us both to learn from and to tweak our strategies, and not one that is rooted in compliance and weaning out who's quality and who's not.
Thank you, Shonda. You're really echoing what Senator Hayden talked about this morning about the hoops that government in particular asks people to jump through and how costly that is for nonprofit organizations. I'm going to stick with you, Shonda, for this next question having to do with scale. If I can paraphrase a little bit, we're talking about big issues here. I mean, we're talking about racial wealth gaps, inequities. I mean, those are huge systemic problems that are decades, if not centuries in the making. The Minneapolis Foundation, but many foundations give out grants in the size of $10,000 to $50,000. And, it seems a little daunting to think about what $10,000 can do to fix, decades of inequities. And this issue came up this morning, talking about how public policy is so important. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that, the kind of scale of grant making versus the scale of the problem. And I just want to invite Catherine Fleming, who asked the question, if I got her question, if she would like to unmute herself and ask or add anything to that. I'm just paraphrasing from the chat.
Yeah, I see the question in the chat. I think that, so the question assumes that you believe money will solve the problem, and I don't assume that. So I don't think money will scale to resolve the inequities that we have. I just don't fundamentally believe that. But I think the point is are we failing at a level that allows people to do the work that they set out to do? In some cases, yes. In some cases, the dollars are there to be catalytic. In some cases, we are there to address immediate issues. The Drake fire, we need to get people in housing. We gave dollars. It was important for them to receive those dollars. In other cases, we funded a table with our Attorney General and Commissioner of Public Safety, where they brought together a working group to look at how to decrease police deadly force. And that was about making recommendations and pushing those forward. And within a year, 24 policy recommendations of like 60 moved forward. I think that that's impactful. So again, I think it's challenging to look at that. I get the point, though, is could we be scaling less people, is what I would say, at a larger amount? That's a consideration. I believe that when we have more people doing work, and one of the things I'll say, and Catherine, I'd love to hear back from you too, is that when someone is out there and has an excellent idea and is making an impact, and they get 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 from us, and it's the first grant that they ever received, and it's able to seed and substantiate and validate their efforts with other foundations and allow them to raise more money, I think it's impactful.
Catherine, do you want to add in your?
Yeah, I just want to say that money does help. And also your restrictions on not being allowed to purchase real estate, which is a foundation for generational wealth. I think that's an issue with most of the foundation and grantors, that real estate is excluded as a point of acquisition for people receiving the grants. And also, I'd like to know how you get the word out as to who you are and what services you provide. I had a discussion with LISC and they told me they'd been in Minneapolis for 38 years. Well, I've been there 15 years and I don't know anything they've done. So I want to know, how do you get the word out to the grassroots community members in addition to other foundations and other resources of the work that you're doing, and what resources might be available?
Yeah, so fair points. And I want to just clarify, I don't think money will resolve the issues that we have. I do think that money helps. We have helped with purchasing, and I think that that's a complicated way of property in the way that philanthropy works. But I think it's an interesting conversation for us to explore, and how we invest in business, Black business, people of color owned businesses. And we usually do that through an intermediary. Many of them are on this call today. So I think that that's a complicated question. And then the last one I think is worth noting in terms of what are our communication strategies and how do we make sure that people are involved. I consider myself a grassroots, like I live in the neighborhood, and I realize that it's very difficult to get to everyone. I think that's always going to be a challenge. And I think that when you meet people that are seeking and you're communicating, you have to meet somewhere. But we are honestly doing our best. And if you think that there's ways we need to advance, and if you think that there are places we be thinking differently about how we market, if you will, our work, I'm open to hearing those suggestions. Jackie, I don't know what you.
Jackie, I'm wondering if you want to respond to this thread about scale, and then I do want to get on to our question about the philanthropic and corporate leaders. So if you want to respond to this, and then I'll ask the next question.
Yeah, real briefly so that we can move on also. Yeah. I think that, Shonda, 2 words you used really kind of sparks in me is catalytic and seed funding. And so at the Bush Foundation, we think that an important role that philanthropy can play is being those first dollars in to test an idea, or to even a stage before that to help develop an idea so that it can be ready to test. At the foundation, we are not afraid to be the first folks in, the first grantors for an organization. That's, a place of honor. I think that it's showing that we believe in this work, or that we're willing to take this risk, and hopefully this will also help then others pay attention or see or have a conversation as well with that organization. And even with the community trust funds, it's $100 million. That's the largest initiative that we've ever done at the foundation. And it's not enough to eradicate wealth disparities in Black and Native American communities, but it can really make a difference for those individuals and families that will be a part of this. And when we launch this program, and even has how I just described it, we use the word seed, that we are seeding to community trust funds with $100 million. And the reason why we say seed is that we think that this is an idea that could really make a difference, that this can make our region better for so many different reasons, because racial wealth disparities, wealth is an indicator of so many other social economic disparities that are within our region. And so we believe that if we can seed these funds, that others can invest as well, individuals, foundations, and other institutions, and they can grow and be even bigger and make a bigger impact.
Thank you, Jackie. So I'm going to ask another question that Ebony has shared that many of you is on many of your minds. So that's the role of philanthropic and corporate leaders as conveners in raising this issue. We have one of our, the sponsor of this session, JP Morgan Chase, is, an example of that. But how do we get more funders to this table, to this conversation? So why don't I throw that to you, Jackie, and then Shonda, you can add in too.
Yeah, for us, like I said, we're seeding in hopes that others will want to do work in ways that make sense for and fit within their strategies. But one of the ways that we are hoping to bring others in is to take advantage any invitation that we receive, like today, to talk about our work. We say yes, and we've had the opportunity to talk about this work in many places here locally, but then also nationally as well. And I think that it is helping to show other institutions ways in which they can also work in and work on the very important and urgent issue of racial wealth disparities. This idea, it came from Edgar Villanueva, the author of Decolonizing Wealth. It was an idea that he posed at the end of his book. You know, what if foundations tithe, use 10% of their endowments in order to invest directly into individuals from Black and Native American communities? And so we were intrigued by that. We got the green light from our board. We reached out to Edgar to find out, hey, what have you been learning from all the institutions that have been taking you up on that idea? And he quickly let us know that no one else had, that we were the first. And so we said, well, let's contract together. We're going to do this work. We want advice from you. And also, as we learn, we want to make sure that you're learning along with us, so that as others are getting into this work, that they can learn from the ways in which we stumble, the ways in which we hopefully make this very successful for our region. And so I think that it's about that, talking about what we're doing, being very open about the ways in which it hits and the ways in which we might miss the target as this goes on further, and hopefully bringing others along.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jackie. And Shonda, how about you? How do we get more of your peers, the community foundations, to the table?
Yeah, my original thought was we don't want everybody at the table. I mean, we need more, right? Like, I mean, we need people that understand the issue at the table. There's been too many people setting tables and inviting people to the table that don't have a handle historically. They don't know the community. They believe they have the answer. And those aren't, we don't need more of them. We need people that, I can see my sister laughing. We need folks at the table that understand the issue, that are coming to the table with a mindset that they don't actually know all the answers. That we need to invite people to the table to make sure that our blind spots are covered. That we need to do it in relationship with community, not just set a table that's separate from community, but with community, informed by community, and on behalf of community. And so I don't believe more gets you there, but I do think more people that are oriented in the right way, that understand the history, that are willing to be at the table in some pretty distinct ways, which means disrupting their own practice, being disruptors in their own institutions, that they're not taking this as an external exercise, but it is an internal commitment to your institutions to do better on behalf of this community. So, I mean, I know I keep sort of like walking around these questions, but, I am seeing an orientation more towards learning and opportunities like this for us to get a deeper handle and understanding of what we need to do. And we're seeing power shifting and people in community basically fed up with practices and behaviors that have not worked. And I think those of us that are ready to hear those criticisms, ready to think deeply about how we show up, and ready to invest more deeply, smartly, and in connection with community will get us closer.
Thank you, Shonda.
Shonda. Oh, it's
Go
you,
ahead.
Susan. I just want to say I like that table metaphor so much. And I was just thinking, the table that we're talking about, it's not the fancy dining room table, like at your auntie's place that has like, the fancy table already set with the napkins and all that. This is more of like the kitchen table where folks are going to be, working very hard. And it's not just for show. This is where the real work is happening.
It always happens in the kitchen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. My family too. I want to invite Terrence Brown had a question in the chat. Don't mean to put you on the spot if you've had to step away, but if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, feel free. And if not, I will ask it on your behalf, Mr. Brown. So Terrence asked a really good question about, what is philanthropy kind of good at and what isn't it? What is it applicable, to solve, to address? It's a tool. It can be very visible, but we're talking about a systemic problem here. So this is a little bit related to Catherine's kind of scale question, but, can you talk about maybe where philanthropy is effective and where it isn't, and any specific measures that are going to kind of get us out of this transactional, you're in, you're out with philanthropy, you kind of get a grant a couple years and then you don't, that kind of fickleness that affects the stability of nonprofit staff. So which one of you would like to jump on those questions first?
I mean, I'll jump,
Go
but
for it.
I'm at a community foundation. So 90% of the dollars that go out of our door are from donor advised fund holders. So they're donor directed dollars. So my role in the foundation's role is to influence where those dollars go. So I want to be clear that it's not just up to staff determination on where those dollars are at. And I think to Catherine's point that, we fund at a much smaller scale per grant than what the Bush Foundation does. And so I hear all of those things, though all the things and all those criticisms are true, but all foundations are not the same. And so coming from a community foundation, I would say that how we use our leadership matters a lot. And granting is one tool. Convening is another tool. I host a podcast there. We do research. Like there's other things that we do collectively that build out what our leadership can look like. We are at tables. We sometimes set tables. There's all kinds of ways in which we can lean into things. And I've told people that have not received grants from us in the past, like they're very competitive and we have limited resources. If you view the relationship as transactional, what you'll do is when you get that decline letter, you will say they didn't fund me. They didn't see my value, and then you're no longer in relationship with us. There's other ways that we can amplify your work. It may not be a fit for us, but we work within a field, within an ecosystem, and I can certainly amplify your work to another funder. The better I know it, the better I know where you fit, the better my team can help navigate that for you. So being transactional happens on more than one side. And what, in my experience, and what I was very surprised about is that leaders of color are not as assertive in their relationships with us as the white leaders are. They're not. They don't show up the same way. Typically, I will have people that want to meet with me every quarter to tell me about their work. It's very rarely a leader of color that does that. I will get email updates from people on a regular basis that we've never funded. Just in case, we want you to know what's going on. And I get that consistently. And so I think that says a lot about our foundation and what our relationship has been and what the comfort level has been within those communities that don't have the same comfort level in reaching out and making sure we know about them.
Thank you, Shonda. I'm actually going to go to another question because we're coming up on time here in a bit. And so Jackie, unless you have something burning, you want to add to that.
Oh, I guess not burning. Go ahead. Keep going.
Well, we can always add if we have time. But I do want to invite Damien to ask your great question.
Thank you, Susan. And I think I'm getting whiplash from agreeing with Shonda, your comments around the table and around showing up and the humility with which we should come to that table. We've been humbled more than once with that issue as we've entered the market. And I think we are learning a lot. And I think we are, in part supporting this table because we've learned similar lessons in other markets. And so 100% agree with you. And we're lucky to have you and others to kind of, help us, on our path. So my question sort of like builds on that, right? Which is to say, what should corporations be doing differently with their philanthropy, with their balance sheet, with all the resources that the private sector could bring to bear with regards to the conversation today, across the board, from policy to philanthropy? What should corporations be doing differently? What does Minneapolis as a community need from us as corporations to do differently in order for you guys, in order for us, for the city to kind of reach its full potential?
So first, they need to diversify their corporate boards, and not see philanthropy and their commitment to equity be externalized. But what is happening in the boardroom, and we're not seeing those numbers change. And we need to have more diverse representation at the leadership level of corporations, because that drives a different level of success in the communities. So I'm very clear sort of about that being one indicator of the seriousness of corporations to make an impact. If you value diversity and equity, it will show up in your leadership ranks. I think secondly, being clear about sort of an all-in strategy, which I guess goes to my first point, that when I was on the other side of the work at Pillsbury United Communities, and I'll use North Market as an example, which is a grocery store in North Minneapolis that I helped lead. One of the greatest gifts that we had from corporations was not always a cash investment, but donations of expertise. 3M came in, all the signage in North Market was in-kind support from 3M. It was instrumental in us getting those doors open. So I think being creative to what impact could look like is important. I think being in relationship with community is essential. And I think that when you're aligning with your, you have to decide how you're aligning, right? Is it your corporate social responsibility alignment? Are you aligning where the needs are in community? I think that there's a number of ways. And one creative way that corporations work with the Minneapolis Foundation is that their foundation might be funding, let's say, in finance, right? Financial literacy. But let's say they're interested in giving to community in different ways. Well, community foundation is a perfect way to extend your philanthropy, corporate philanthropy. And that happens quite a bit locally, where we provide some additional expertise and help get dollars out, or help inform our corporate partners on the issues, or get them in relationships. We do that quite frequently. So I know, Damien, that's probably not all of what you hoped for, but I do think, diversification at the board level, looking at those marketing dollars, how you amplify folks' leadership and how you provide access. So again, one of the things I've thought about when I was on the nonprofit side is there's a lot of corporations that bring in amazing speakers that have wonderful sort of professional development opportunities that many of our nonprofit leaders don't have access to or can't afford. That is one way of just saying we want to make this available to you. And then I think in terms of the way that you fund, I would really focus on the how and see where you might be able to extend it and double down.
Thank you, Shonda. And I'm going to go to our question and topic of impact investing and ask Jackie to talk about that. But first, Ebony asked me to frame impact investing up just a little bit. So impact investing is investing intentionally for positive financial return and positive measurable social impact. So it's not a grant, it's not an investment of a grant, it's actually money that can come back. Sometimes it comes back over time. Sometimes it's a 1% loan. Sometimes it's a market rate investment that does very, very well. There's all types of impact investments and there's all types of impact investors. But going back to this question of scale and the problem we're trying to discuss this morning, this afternoon, about racial equity and the systemic issues that have caused it. When you're looking at a foundation, particularly like a private fund, let's take a private foundation first. Typically they give away 5% of their assets every year, and then they're kind of, what about the other 95%? And can any of that be used to advance mission? And then I'll ask Jackie to ask that, and then Shonda, you're in a community foundation, very different position since you're not in control of all of those dollars because of the donors. But maybe if you can comment on impact investing, is that a tool that we should be considering in addressing the racial wealth divide? So over to you, Jackie.
Yeah, at the Bush Foundation, we have an impact investing strategy that has it focuses on two goals, both equity and place. And so for equity, it is about advancing equity in capital markets. So the funds that we work with, and before we work with any fund manager, we ask questions about how do you address racial equity, implicit bias, DEI issues in your practices and policies at your firm. That's one of the deciding factors that something that we ask when we're considering new funds. But then also that we are seeking out funds that are managed by BIPOC leaders, and also funds that use that money in order to address and support, in particular, entrepreneurs that are working in low income and middle income issues in marginalized communities. And so an example would be a fund that we work with called Impact America. It's a fund that's led by a Black woman, and those funds are used to support entrepreneurs of color. Also, another example would be Four Bands. That's a native CDFI that is based out of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, where we are using those funds in order to support businesses and organizations that Four Bands works with. And so in 2020, with our investment impact strategy, we released an RFI, just an open call for ideas and organizations that were interested in being supported by our impact investing. And as of last March, we've made about $33 million in those very directed, impact investments. And we also do, grant funding that supports social businesses and PRIs, which are, very low interest loans for capital for organizations. So that's work that we are excited about and will continue to grow into the future.
Way to activate your other 95%, Jackie. So Shonda, you said you have control over about 5%, I think, of the money that you said was coming in. Could you talk both about the corpus that you do have, but also the donors' interest in impact investing, or your opinion on impact investing? And I want to encourage everyone to listen to Shonda's podcast on this topic. We'll maybe pop a link to that in the chat.
Thanks. Yeah, the one in particular was with John Rogers from REL Investment. I think he's just brilliant. And I said 10%, so we're probably more at 12%. All right. Minneapolis Foundation, and about 90% or so goes out. But I still think, I think that what Bush Foundation and others are doing with their endowments are pretty impressive. And even with the dynamics that we are working in, we could do more at the Minneapolis Foundation, and we're exploring that actually now. So we do have PRIs, we do impact investing, we have a co-investment opportunity with some of our donors. And we have funded into business and development opportunities, and we can do it through PRIs where we can't do it with our grant making, because that tool allows for us to do that, to, again, Catherine's earlier point. But I think that there's more opportunity for us to be creative about what those investment strategies look like. And as we're exploring that at the Minneapolis Foundation, again, I welcome folks to reach out with ideas, because we are seeking them. And I think we put out maybe 6 million a year in that investment portfolio.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Shonda. And I see Ebony is back on, is kind of giving me the verbal or the Zoom boot here. So I got to wrap up this great conversation from two of our absolute leading ladies, not just in the metro, but I'd say in the country. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel. You've given us all a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the candor and the grace of both of you bring to this important work with community. Really so lucky to have you in our town. And Ebony, I want to thank you for a great intro and session, and back to you for the rest of the afternoon. Ebony, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so thank you everyone for that discussion. It was a real authentic discussion. I felt like people were able to really talk about just some of the challenges, but also just a lot of ways of thinking differently around how the funding community really supports and be in partnership with community members and community organizations that are BIPOC led. I did want to just take some time to see, because one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we did in this space was to see if there was some other solutions, some other ways of our ideas of innovative solutions that our audience had that think would be useful in this conversation. And so I just wanted to just take about 5-10 minutes and pose a question. The question is, if you're a funder or maybe even a stakeholder, how are you expanding your network and leveraging capital to prioritize communities of color? What would you like to see happen with investments? What role do you want to play? And so this is something that, again, I want to pose from the audience, because I also feel like community members, and I know the leaders that we work with through the Building High Impact for Nonprofits of Color project, they have a lot of ideas around this. And I don't want this to be a one-way streak. I do want this to be something that is also informing for our funders, our impact investors, our corporate folks on the call as well. So I'll just give folks a couple of minutes just to put some thoughts, and if you could just throw them in the chat box, that would be great. So again, how are you expanding your network? How are you leveraging capital within your own institution? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a funder. It could be, I know we have people that are CDFIs on here who are investing in community entrepreneurs and small businesses. So what are you doing to leverage your capital? How are you making sure that the community is really informing the work that you're doing? And what role do you want to play in this?
Ebony, one of the, I know I just got through talking, so hopefully y'all are tired of me, but one of the things that we're doing at the foundation, we have our Fund for Safe Communities, which is a fund that looks at violence reduction and systems work and policing. And that fund is advised by emerging leaders under 30. All of them are folks of color. They advise and direct and forward to me what they think we should be funding on. And it goes both ways. It goes through an application process, and then there's unsolicited grants. I don't consider anything that they haven't already reviewed and given opinion on. And we're starting to build that into other processes. It does take a little bit longer if you're like a task person, like you do have to slow down a bit to build the relationship and the trust. And I have to manage myself so that they're not saying what they think I want to hear, but they're actually giving me good advice, and and that we're following up on that. So I'm working to do that more and more in our grant processes. And then with all of our new strategies, those are all advised. So we'll bring them out to nonprofit leaders. We'll talk to folks that we want to benefit from those investments, and then they help shape the work that we do at the foundation.
Awesome. Thank you for those, that extra additional information, and just lifting up just a different model, and how you're giving power within the community to make the decisions on how that money is being utilized. David, I see your comment. Would love to see this type of platform to be replicated periodically and often, welcoming more funders and supporters. Definitely. Any other comments? And I'm also just going to bug a couple of my leaders out here, because the space is for you. So I want to make sure that you're not being shy and not being aggressive, and saying how you feel or where you see some opportunities.
I guess I do have a quick question for my sister. When you talk about making sure, Shonda, sorry, just in case people don't know, when you're talking about making sure that people aren't just giving you, say that again, Ebony.
Introduce yourself, please.
I'm Shannon Smith-Jones. I'm the executive director at Hope Community. When you're talking about making sure that people aren't just telling you what you want to hear, I can only imagine that that is consistently like challenging to get people to like shift how they've done the work. What are some of the things and strategies that you're doing to make sure that people feel like they can bring their authentic selves to you, so that you can really kind of get to the root of what's happening?
Yeah, with the advisory committee, for instance, I didn't attend their discussions, so I don't attend the meetings. And which gives them some safety in the group, so they can come back and say, this is what the group thinks, and I can go back and forth with them by email or other ways. Over the last 2 years that we've had that advisory, they've gotten very good at pushing back. And I think part of that is, I remember they made, I was going to fund something and sent it to them, and I said, this is something I want to fund. They came back and said they didn't think we should fund it, and why. And I came in pretty dead set on doing that, and I reversed my decision. And then the group invited that particular nonprofit to come to one of their advisory committee meetings, where they were able to talk with them about why that funding was denied. And then together it clarified, and they came back with revised and frankly better, stronger proposal that was actually more of what the grantee wanted, because they were trying to fit into what they thought the guidelines were. And so I think that part of it, Shannon, is just having the proof points, that how I build trust is that when they actually see their ideas getting implemented, when they actually see themselves reversing my decision or forwarding a decision that I hadn't thought about, and making sure that I'm providing ways for them to grow, that it's not a relationship that I'm benefiting from, but again, it's a relationship that we're in together on behalf of the community, and that their voice is just as valuable, and that I just won't trump what they say. I just won't do that.
Thank you for that. So now I'm going to give you guys actually a 10-minute break, because I know from for my folks who have been on here from the beginning, you could utilize one. We do have one more session left around effective cross collaboration. How can we move from competition to silos, move from competition and silos to partnership and collective strategy? Something else that has been a theme throughout the day as well. And so we're going to come back, and actually Shannon and Marcus Owens will be leading that discussion. But it is 2:35 your time. We're going to begin this session in 10 minutes. So if you want to stay on, feel free, but please go take your bathroom breaks, your food breaks, whatever you need to do. And please join us back here in 10 minutes for our last discussion. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. Sure, everyone's just getting back to their computers here. Got my partner in crime here, Shannon.
Yes, I am here. And just so you all know, Akua Ellis is joining us, and this is going to be a gift of love and labor when she hops on, because she is in Jamaica on vacation and still decided to join us and is trying to connect right now.
All right. Well, let's do a quick intro, huh?
Yes.
Maybe we can catch her as she comes in.
So, hello, everyone. I briefly introduced myself earlier as I was asking Shonda a question. I am Shannon Smith-Jones. I am the executive director at Hope Community, which is a nonprofit in the Phillips community in South Minneapolis that does housing and community building and has been around for the last 44 years. And as it relates to this conversation, I am also the co-chair of the philanthropy pillar for the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity.
Right, and I'm Marcus Owens, the executive director at the African American Leadership Forum, which is also part of this great cohort of organizations and leaders looking to solve the racial wealth divide. ALF is also leading an effort called United by Black, Powered by All, which you will hear within this conversation. And I'm also a co-chair of the allyship pillar for the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity. So we're really excited to bring you all together. And then want to introduce you to James Burrows. James, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. James Burrows. I'm Vice President and Chief Equity Inclusion Officer at Children's Minnesota. In that role, I do equity inclusion work. Also, too, I'm a co-chair of the workplace pillar for the MBCRE as well. So I'm glad to be here, glad to be a part of this conversation.
Excellent. And did Akua join us yet?
I don't think Akua is on, so we will let Akua hop in.
She'll be joining in just a second. She's just within the waiting room.
Oh, well, let's wait a second then so we can get Akua on board. Thank you guys for your patience in all of this.
Shannon, are you there, Shannon?
I am.
Breathe. We got this. We got this.
I said they were making me nervous. They're all like waiting. I was like, I need y'all to get on. You're making me sweat. So Akua is now here. Akua, we just have done brief introductions. Will you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Akua Ellis, and in my day job, I'm Senior Vice President of Community Impact for Greater Twin Cities United Way. And in this capacity, I serve alongside Shannon, Marcus, and James on the steering committee for the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity and co-chair of the policy pillar.
Excellent, excellent. Shannon, why does this conversation matter?
This conversation matters. This has been an interesting experience being on the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity, but I think it matters because as Black-bodied individuals doing this work and doing cross-sector work, I think it's extremely important for us to dialogue the triumphs, the challenges, and be able to build off one another and actually be able to rely on one another, so that we can troubleshoot, so that we can vent in a constructive manner, and so that we can continue to keep our hearts and minds in the work. You know, so I think that's why we're here. I would like to pivot though to JB. We lovingly call him JB and Akua, and ask them to explain to us, JB, what exactly is the Minnesota Business Coalition for Racial Equity, and why did you decide to be a part of this coalition?
Sure, thanks, Shannon and Marcus. MBCRE, as we call it because the name is too long, started right after the murder of George Floyd. James Moman, who we call JMO, was at the time the Chief Diversity Officer at General Mills, and he said enough is enough. He rallied some of his colleagues in philanthropy and diversity and said, you know, we got to do something different. So he asked us to come together and start a coalition that was organically put together to say, we got to do something different, particularly for Black people. And in doing that, we wanted to make sure that we not only looked at jobs, we also looked at philanthropy, we also looked at allyship, and also too, we also looked at other areas as well. I'll be honest with you, when it started, I was like, nah, I'm good. I'm not trying to start another thing to call it another thing, to do the same nonsense we haven't done in the 29 years I lived in Minnesota. So I dropped out early on. I was like, James, appreciate you. Akua remembers because she called me. I'm like, hey, you coming back? I was like, nope, I'm good. But Akua, Reba, Dominski, who's a part of this, called me and said, hey, we're really going to do this together. And we're going to work and make some changes in a deliberate, effective, outcome-oriented kind of way. And we're not going to just be another, this is filter-free Tuesday or Monday. We're not going to just be another Itasca. We're not going to be just another greater MSP. We're not going to be just another thing that we call a corporate-led organization, where we're going to do some real things for real people. So that's how I got here. I think we are making some ground, some headway, doing some good ground game work. We have a long way to go. We haven't reached anything that we wanted to yet as far as outcomes. We've made some incremental things along the way in policy, in workplace, and in allyship, but we haven't reached the end goal yet on this 100+ yard football field. But that's how I got here, and that's why I'm here.
Thank you, JB. Akua, JB did a really good job of kind of explaining what MBCRE. I'm also curious if you had anything to add to that, but also what made you decide that this was a coalition that you wanted to invest your time and energy into?
Yeah, so JB brought the smoke. I appreciate that. For those on the call, in our steering committee meetings on Fridays, we talk about having filter-free Fridays, where we just keep it all the way real. You know, what I would add to JB's recollection is I remember being a part of one of those initial calls and having a very similar reaction. And part of what brought me back to the table and keeps me at the table, you know, are the folks on this screen. There are times where one of us may, like, we rely on each other, and I think in a really healthy way, we bring different skills and strengths and can help each other tap back in. You know, acknowledge when, like, hey, you seem disconnected or you seem kind of bothered about that. You know, we are committing to doing things differently and aligning with each other in ways that, you know, maximize our individual skills. And that's actually, very honestly, what keeps me at the table. That and the promise of this coalition. I do believe that there's significant progress to be made, and that this coalition has a really important point, or not point, but voice in advancing that. So those are the reasons, but largely y'all.
Excellent. Thanks, Akua. So kind of going on that same theme there, and maybe, Akua, you can start since you kind of started to go there, is talk about a little bit around why you think the value of this coalition is different than other coalitions you've either been a part of or that are out there right now. What's the unique value you think here?
Yeah, so two things. One is the focus on Black Minnesotans. So we've talked around marginalized communities, disenfranchised, under invested. I mean, like there's a number of kind of terms that folks will use oftentimes and mean different things, but we're explicit in our focus around Black Minnesotans. And I think that's a big part that makes this work unique. The other piece, and Marcus, you'll laugh at this because, part of the back and forth that you and I have is around trying to figure out how we really do this work that is centered and led by Black leadership and Black voices, while recognizing that the way that work has traditionally been done and even the way I might approach something, makes that challenging. So part of what makes this different is we've made a commitment and we're like wrestling through the muck to figure out how to actualize on that commitment. But the reason why it's so challenging is because I don't think it's been done before. And so we're forging new territory, which again, makes the relationships that we bring to this work prior to all that much more important.
Yes, thank you. JB, anything that you'd add to around the value proposition for the coalition?
Go hit it on the head. I think I double down or double click on is that she said it's being led and centered by Black people. You'll get into it a little bit later about how Alf got involved and how the Boulé came about and all that. But we had a unfiltered conversation with myself and Greg Cunningham, who was a part of Boulé, about, not everybody Black thinks the same. Not everybody Black looks the same. We all have a variety of different ideas and we come to the table in different ways. So I like about this one is we're not always in agreement. And this is for the white people on the call, let me be clear. When you bring Black organizations together, don't automatically assume they all are going to agree to the same thing. Don't automatically assume that they don't have various opinions. Some of them, opposite of that. But it doesn't mean they can't work together collectively. It doesn't mean that we can't get some great outcomes collectively for Black people in Minnesota. So I think a cool hit it on the head, but I just add that to say that's something that's unique about this organization as well.
That's great. And just for you all, just for context, James was referencing the conversation around how different coalitions have kind of formed over this past year and a half. The coalition here for racial equity being the primary coalition that's bringing the business community as well as the Black community together. And then parallel to that was an effort formerly known as the Alliance of Alliances that was led by a group of Black men from a Black fraternity called Mclean Boulé. And I've kind of come in the middle of all this to figure out, okay, we all have different approaches to this work. We all have different relationships. We all have different ideas. But at the end of the day, we all have the same goal and the same intent, and that's to impact our community in a positive way that changes and amplifies the experiences that we want to have as a community collectively. So, the point that you made, JB, around just because a foundation or a corporation brings a Black organization in, it doesn't mean they represent all of us. And you have to get different perspectives whenever you come into this work because it's so dynamic and it's so unique. So thank you for calling that out. Shannon, I'm going to give it to you for the next questions.
Thank you. You guys have touched on this a little bit around the cross-sector piece of this coalition. In working with corporations, I'm curious, JB, I'm asking this to you. Have you experienced any challenges in this coalition building work as a Black man trying to navigate this space and this cross-sector, corporate, nonprofit, all these different places that we're in? And if so, can you speak to that?
I want to keep my job today, but okay, my boss knows me anyway. Yes. It's hard being an authentic Black man in Minnesota. I'll say that one more time. It's hard being an authentic Black man in Minnesota because sometimes in these conversations, people get scared of what you say. They get intimidated by what you say. They think that Only you can present it in a certain way, and it's got to be the Minnesota nice way, and everybody has to feel good after the conversation. So for me, that's been hard navigating some of those conversations. That I want to be passionate, I want to be impactful, I want to be thoughtful and respectful. But at the end of the day, I want you to understand that this means something to me. I can't have a 9-year-old daughter. My daughter's name is Teresa, come into a state where we have these horrid outcomes for Black people, and me say I'm going to raise her here and be okay with that. I'm not. I get upset about it. I get passionate about it. So I think for me as a Black man, helping navigate that space has been challenging. The other piece is, let's be honest, on two things. One is these nonprofit spaces and corporate spaces are very misogynistic. Women's voices aren't being heard the way they should be. And for me, I had to rely upon Shannon, Akua, Shantara, just to say, hey, did you see the same thing I saw in that meeting where you got, not listened to? And better yet, rather than asking that question, the next meeting they said to me, do something and say something about it. And I've been able to do that and say, you know what, we're not going to play the same game the same way, and making sure that we're not misogynistic and not shutting out Black women. I love my Boulay brothers. The Omicron are a great fraternity, which means men. If you're on this call, fraternities are men, sororities are women. Well, now women involved in those discussions. I'm like, listen, Greg, Deshaun, all who are my friends, unless we get women involved, Black women who we have as part of the NBCRE involved in this too, we got to make sure we're working together. So as a Black man, that's what's challenging too. Shannon, just making sure that we don't end up misogynistic in a way and having the conversations. And the last thing I'll say is bringing my full self. I love my white brother, Charlie Weaver, for the MVP. We've developed a bond together, but Charlie and I don't agree on a lot of things related to racial equity, but we've agreed to have a continued conversation, not only talking, but showing actions towards each other to make sure that we change the way we think of things, the way we do things. And I pick out Charlie because he's like the CEOs who are mostly white men. He's like the directors and leaders, VPs who are mostly white men. We got to create a dialogue that allows me to still be my authentic Black male self, and not what I used to call code switch. I don't do code switching anymore. I never did, but now I'm way beyond code switching. And I'm not going to lose my soul for anybody except the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So that's for me. As a Black man, I've showed up that way, and I want to continue to encourage others to show up that way as well. And we got to support them. What we can't do is let somebody show up that way, then I turn around and nobody has my back. So that's something else we've had to do as well. So it's not just Black men, but Black men and Black women in this space. So I'll stop there, Shannon.
Cool. I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm curious though, JB, first, before I do that. We're talking about ourselves in this space as it relates to work. Could you, and either one of you actually could do this, could you speak to what we see? I think we have experienced many Black leaders that are embedded in corporate environments that are really struggling to navigate in this space that we're pulling them into. And you kind of talked about speaking up for folks in that. And I know I'm digressing just a little bit, but you just brought it to my mind to say, is there anything that you would say to that?
Yes, we got to support them outwardly. So imagine being in corporation 20 years, 15 years, you're the only Black person in leadership or one of the few. You can't do too much that's going to rock the ship or rock the boat at a big corporation, because you need to, one, maintain your leadership role, two, support others coming behind you, and three, Minnesota is great for Minnesota nice, but once you start saying something outside of the realm of what they want to hear, people try to get rid of you. Let's be candid. So I think that's been hard on brothers and sisters in those roles. So as that voice that Marcus is bringing through ALF, that the Boulay came together with the Alliance of the Lions, we got to make sure we're supporting those brothers and sisters, because we got to give them voice to say, I can be my authentic self. I can bring my full flavor to the meeting. I can bring my full flavor here and challenge you. But they have to have that support, because if they don't, it's hard to hang on and be the only person in the room being your authentic self, and forces may be pushing against you, called systemic racism, called structural racism, called white supremacy as well.
Thank you, JB. Akua, Same question to you. Do you need me to repeat it? I can if you need me to.
Yes, which one?
Right. Experience challenges as a Black woman navigating this space. And I guess I would add to your question, in hindsight, is there anything you would have done differently to prepare yourself for this space?
Oh, that second one is a loaded one. I'll start with the first one. How have I experienced leadership in the coalition as a Black woman? There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind for me. The first is being mindful. Operating in this space, in this body, has required me to remain mindful of triggers, so that I don't allow them to cloud a reaction or a response, and undermine, work that is happening, while also remaining true and authentic to myself. So that has been a pretty consistent kind of need, that I don't know that others would mind as much, because they may not necessarily be navigating the internalized desire to thwart an angry Black woman kind of posture as a very direct communicator. It's something that I'm already really aware of. And I don't want to say self-conscious about, but self-aware for sure. There have been instances, particularly earlier on in the coalition, where, just because folks sign up and are participating in the coalition doesn't necessarily mean that they're aligned with the mission, that they've done any sort of internal reflection, and certainly any sort of external training to prepare them to show up in the space and not cause harm. And so there were instances earlier within the policy pillar where it was clear to others, because I started to get the calls after the call. It was apparent that my leadership was being either dismissed or questioned or actively undermined. And there was a period of time where I thought, you know what, I'm not gonna respond to that. I know and like who I am. People's interpretations of who I am or what they think of me is not my business. And what was interesting was I had a young Black woman who was working within a corporation reach out, and in expressing frustration about a persistent challenge in the pillar. What was clear to me was that I was inadvertently communicating to her that that's how she needed to allow herself to be treated in order to sit at tables of privilege and influence. And so, I shared that learning with our pillar, and committed to, shutting down that behavior, which I would have summarily have done in any other setting. Like, just shut it down quickly. Like that is my way. But in the desire to advance the work and keep us moving and not get hung up on personalities, I just chose to ignore it. And so I guess in hindsight, something that I would have done differently to prepare myself for the role would be, developing some sort of a clear sense for my level of commitment so that I could pace myself, pace my participation, and also keep in mind a clear sense of success that would allow me to better calibrate. We've all been operating at a pace in this last year that's not sustainable. And I'm realizing that more in hindsight, but yeah, those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for asking the question.
Wow, that whole perspective of cool around pacing ourselves is like so critical, because it doesn't take a year or 18 months to overcome everything that has taken place over 400 years, right? And the pressure that we put on ourselves to try to come into this work, seats on fire and ready to roll, sometimes takes that energy out of us in the long term. So as you guys are thinking about this, and Nicole, I'll start with you. It's like, how do we define success for this work of coalition, and particularly the MBCRE?
Put that on me first. I was hoping JB would tackle that. I think there's a personal answer to that question, and then the coalition-wide answer. Yeah. For me, so much of what holds the problems that we're seeking to address in place is the absence of really naming it and having being able to create a clear thread between those practices, and ultimately the impact of practices that we kind of hold as status quo. On a personal level, hearing and seeing more growth and more recognition of the need to make those ties and to do that work feels like personal success. It feels like, I'm advancing change in some way at the individual level among individuals who have, significant influence within their organizations. So there's that piece. As a coalition, I think the more that we can have, create a space where not only like challenges and or mistakes can be acknowledged, and we can, demonstrate what it looks like to really lean into the wisdom of folks closest to challenges, and can demonstrate progress. Like we need benchmarks, right? So progress relative to the outcomes that we seek to advance. Like some of you all know I'm a wonk, so I'm like, okay, what does the data say? So the data, I think, speaks to the larger kind of longer term impact, but there's all sorts of inflection points where change is possible. And so when I think about success, I'm thinking about it in a multitude of ways.
Excellent. JB, same question. What does success look like for you personally, and thinking about the coalition as a whole?
Yeah, I'll start with the coalition. That we are an unapologetic body of 80 different corporations who don't have solutions that are just tailor-made for acquiescence and saying that, oh, that's something nice that we did, a little hand clap, but we're really challenging and disrupting the system. So in workplace inclusion, if we at the end of our let's say 2 years, that be a part of this next year, if I don't call my colleagues up and say, hey, you know what, how many Black people do you have in your C-suite? And if the answer is 0, that I'm on them saying that's unacceptable. I'll say, how much money are we spending with Black-owned businesses? If the answer is 2%, that's unacceptable. If we're saying that we're going to engage with the Black community and you had 2 focus groups and 5 people showed up and you say, you know what, we heard from their perspective what the Black community wants, that's unacceptable. So I'm giving you a lot of unacceptable things, Marcus, intentionally, because that's what we've tended to do in the 30 years I've been up here. We can't do that anymore. So it has to be the opposite of that for success. And then for me, success too is, and this is a personal one, that we are eliminating some of the misogyny in our own community. And this is the Black folks part of the conversation. Black men and Black women, we can't be ignoring their voices and pretend they don't exist. We acknowledge that and fix that. And the other piece of it is too, that we create a growth path for my daughter, Akua's son, Shannon's kids, your kids, Marcus, that they see being Black in Minnesota is not a deficit, that they never have to hear the term disparity ever again in their life, that we've created a system that's going to be not about disparities for them, but they're going to be the next governor, the next senators, the next other things as well, because we've created that path for them. That's success to me. That excites me. We have a long way to go, but I think if we disrupt the system, we're successful.
Thank you, JB. And that's a really good, you kind of touched on a couple points there around what's not acceptable, right, from corporations. I am curious to know, what advice would you give corporations that want to build relationships in cultural communities, specifically as this conversation goes, Black communities?
Can I start with that one?
Go ahead, Akua.
So they can start with their employees of color, right? That's a hugely underutilized resource within many of these corporations. And the interesting thing through this coalition that I have learned is that so few corporations actually have affinity groups or employee resource groups. Like that's a pretty low threshold, right? So like you could start by one hiring and then like providing space and support for nurturing. So there's that. I serve on a board of a large organization, and they, on this DEI journey, and I raised my hand and asked, like, what do your Black employees say? What do your employees of color have to say? And they sheepishly acknowledged that they had only recently thought to ask them. Okay, so like that's the first thing, which is just like, I know, mind blowing. But that would require you to like honor their perspectives and to come to the conversation assuming that there's value to be gleaned from those conversations. That's another panel. The second is, I think, to look internally to determine the extent to which your practices or your environment is conducive to those relationships. I think there's growing inquiry among the broader public about what the inside of these organizations look like and the extent to which their actions align with their stated values. You've got to be able to walk the talk because people have access to greater information and can measure the extent to which you're like even real in your request to have a relationship.
Thank you, Akua. JB?
Stole all the thunder there. So I agree with Akua. Get your own house in order. So before you start reaching out to the community, I used to be at a law firm back in the day. I won't mention their name because maybe they've changed now. But back in the day, that law firm would go to the community and invest in pro bono hours and sponsor this, sponsor that, and then never look at how oppressive it was for their Black attorneys inside their own firm. Never asked us for our opinion, never supported us with mentors or sponsors, never gave us work, never showed us how to get work or business. And we all left at some point to be successful other places. But if our house wasn't in order, you can't go out and say, I want to create partnerships. So I think first, get your own house in order, as Akua said, using and leveraging your ERGs. And I want to say this out loud, your ERGs are more than just a celebration month. Don't just talk to the Black people during Black History Month, the Latin people during Latino History Month, so on and so on. Talk about them about the business operations and how they can be supported. And also invest in them too. Don't give $5 out of your $30 billion budget to your ERGs, invest in them going forward. The other thing I'll say is you got to invest in Black-owned businesses. If all the Black-owned businesses were impacted, which they were, by the pandemic and the civil unrest of the murder of George Floyd, you can't very well say, man, I don't know what to do. Well, yes, you do. Spend some money on Black-owned businesses. I got an easy one for you. This is the first Independence Bank's coming to town. Let's be clear. I'm not getting any money from this. I don't have any shares in First Independence Bank. But if it's a Black bank coming to town, if you're a corporation and you don't have some of your significant money in that Black bank, don't talk to me about investing in community, because that bank can invest in the community in partnership with you to create change in the community as well. Now, I'm gonna hold that Black bank accountable as well, because just because they're Black owned doesn't mean they're doing something for Black community. I got to show them how to do that, or ask them what they're doing and all that too. So I think that's the other part of it as well. So I think those things would be important to me, Shannon, about how we move forward.
JB, that bank has nothing to do with it being from Detroit, right?
Yeah, I am biased about that bank. Yeah, the Detroit piece I'm biased about, those who know me, but the other piece, no, just put it in there and invest in it. I'll say this too. I mean, another thing corporations can do, Shannon, real quick. They have $1 billion in assets or endowments or other things as well. How are they investing that money through equity and private equity firms? Are they holding those firms accountable to invest in those things that help the Black community in Minnesota, but also nationally as well? We're looking at children's, our $1 billion in investment. Are we spending it in a way that's consciously investing in communities? We'll get a great rate of return on it, but also too, we'll invest in something that's beneficial to the community. So that's another way. And I hate to say this, but also too, accountability. Stop pretending that you don't have the data, and stop pretending if I ask you a question, you ask me a question, hey, are you trying to hire people of color? Yep, 34% every year is my goal to hire people of color. Hey, have you met that goal? Nope, 21% of my people of color leave Children's Hospital right now. We got to do a better job. Hey, how many do you have in leadership? 15.6% are in leadership positions, up from 9% last year. Companies got to get off their behind and say what they're doing and give the data, and then say I'm working on it. But you can't, those days of saying I don't know, I can't find it, don't know what the data is, those have to be behind us for now. So, all right, too much talking, Shannon. Stop me. I'm going on mute.
Not just add one more. First of all of that, JB. One other thing. So I was looking at Catherine's comment in the chat around what we have started talking about as double talk. So making a pledge over here and then advancing policy, usually that is either undermining or at exact, cross purposes. I think that's an important piece. And And honestly, given that this is an economic development conversation, I think beyond the coalition, but as a broader kind of, I'd say as a country, if we can start to have a real conversation around the impact of tax policy on these divides, that will feel like real progress to me, because even among partners who I feel like are really invested in their companies, genuinely want to be all in, like the tax policy is what stops a lot of people dead in their tracks. And so I think that is the, I don't say the final frontier, but that is a tremendous conversation that we've got to be honest about, and really see policy that aligns with that understanding for those companies who are signing up to be a part of addressing inequity.
That's great. Okay, so I got a question, but I'm going to give maybe like a preamble to the question, because it's all about lessons learned, right? And coming into coalition work, we all have great energy. We think we see the vision of where we want to go, and then we get into coalition and we get into the work of coalition because there's processes, there's things that have to happen in order for the coalition to work, right? One of the lessons that I've learned in this whole idea of coalition building, meaning that you have cross-sector partners, you have different ideas, different ways of thinking, is that oftentimes we come in coalition work, particularly this work this past year, with predetermined what I can or cannot do's, right? For instance, I've heard a lot around, particularly when it relates to the private sector and what it can do for community. It's this approach of charity and, how can we support the community through charity, but not through the ideas that you guys just laid out specific to what's happening in the four walls, right? And oftentimes I've heard this happen, and it's how do we get through this conversation, but it's around, well, we can't support this policy, or we can't support, whether it's minimum wage or paid medical leave, or all these things that community has said that they want and they need. What other lessons, or how can you guys expound upon that around lessons learned around coalition building and how we overcome some of those hurdles? Cool, May, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think if we talk about systems change, part of what comes up for me is like the waters for systems change that FSG has socialized quite a bit. And a big part of what is required in order to drive lasting systemic change is a shift in mental models, like our understanding of the way the world works. And I would say the blessing and the challenge, sorry, I got some background noise.
She just has a little Jamaica going on behind her, you guys.
So I think the blessing and the challenge of this moment that we find ourselves in is that everything has been disrupted in terms of what work can be done remotely, like all of our notions, what our kids need in school and what's possible or isn't possible, like all of that is turned on its head. And so it presents an opportunity and fertile ground to do that different thinking.
JB, what do you think?
Yeah, I think Cool makes a great point. I'm loving the fact she's on vacation trying to pretend like she's not the background noise, but I digress. I think for me, if it doesn't hurt, you're not doing anything different. So when corporations say they can't do something, changing tax policy or changing paid parental leave, it's going to hurt the bottom line in their pockets. So therefore they say they can't do it. But in fact, they've made so much money in this pandemic year, it's ridiculous. It's a whole lot more revenue generated by corporations than we've ever had and seen in this country. So they can do a lot of things if they choose not to, because if it hurts the financial picture for them, they don't want to do it. Also, too, I'm tired of hearing the fact that, it's not legal. We can't do that. Every time I talk about a number, like we're setting a goal, well, that's illegal, isn't it? It's not a quota, James? Nope, it's not. I got a law degree from many, many years ago. I don't use it anymore. But they're not quotas. They're goals set in order to get to a certain particular place. And ain't nobody going to sue us right now in the midst of all the stuff that has happened. People are going to try to reach and achieve those goals. So I think, Marcus, corporations have to hurt a little. People have to hurt a little to say that, okay, just like when you work out in the gym, if it pains a little bit, but not too much, you know, you don't want to stop, but we can't stop now. We have to have that pain, work through it, and endure it as well. The other thing too is in the community, we have to do a better job of talking to each other. And I'm calling us out on this call too, that we got to be able to fight well and protect our own mental health. The thing I love about this coalition too, there's enough Black people on the steering committee that if I say, you know what, I did a mental health day, I'm taking a day off, my sister's got my back, Marcus got my back. I ain't worried about it going awry by people only having one Black voice on a board or on a steering area. And then also in our community, we got to be able to have real talk, Marcus. And this is where it's not the Alliance anymore. I will get the name right at some point. I was about to call it up. Okay, I was about to call it up by something, but my bad. I got it. Power by Black. We got to make sure that we can have honest conversations where we disagree, but we can still say, you know what, in the benefit of working for Black people, this is what we're going to do. And a lot of times we don't do that very well in our community. And then this person stops talking to that person stops talking to the other person. And we don't do what we should do for our community. And I'm committed to doing that differently myself, because I've done that before myself and not affiliated myself with some people in the Black community anymore. But I got to get out of that and say, you know what, I need to work together with people collectively and do better. And so that's going to challenge myself as well.
That's great. Thanks for that. And it's United by Black, powered by all. For those, I'm put it in the chat for you so that you can see it. It's got to become commonplace here, folks. But JB, I appreciate that, because I think one thing that's been unique about this experience is that, and I think for everybody that we have here, Shannon, Nakua, you, like, we've all caught each other when we're like, did I hear that right? Do I feel this right? Is this where we're going? And having those moments with leaders like you all allow for me to keep doing this work. Because if we don't have each other's back, if we don't have the ability to just reach out to each other, it is a very isolating and lonely space that you keep going down a path and you didn't realize that you've left everybody behind you. So, you know, I think that's a big part. Are there any other lessons learned about coalition building that you guys want to share with the audience?
You know, one of the things that I think is a continuous through line is that we are individuals embedded in organizations. And I think one of the lessons, or I don't know if it's a lesson or just something that I'm always reminded of, is that an individual can be at a place that the company they're embedded in is not. And so when you're building coalitions, the folks at the table, I think half of the conversation sometimes is, okay, this is where you're at. This is what you want to do. Is everybody else behind you in your company on board with where you're at and what you're doing and where you're going? And how can we support you on internal strategies so that as we're doing this work, we don't get all this energy in the coalition and then you go back to your company and then you're kind of stalled out. And so I think for me, that is one of the lessons learned of like making sure that there's a continual internal check-in with the organizations that are a part of the coalition, because they may very well believe in the end goal, right? But they may not believe in like actually realizing what it actually takes to get to that place. And I think sometimes it sounds real nice. And then when it gets down to the work and you realize you gotta, roll up your sleeves and get a little dirty, they're like, oh, I thought we were gonna stay clean in the process, or it wasn't gonna be so difficult. I didn't know we would have to give up something, or we need to change how we're thinking about things. And to me, that's one of the lessons that continuously comes up in my space. I don't know about you, JB or Akua.
I think it's, you hit on the head, because I'll start my company. Children's Minnesota was built upon a foundation of systemic racism. I'll say it one more time. We are built upon a foundation of systemic racism. In order to dismantle and disrupt that, when I go back from the coalition meeting and say we're going to do something different, I'm fighting against systemic racism that's the foundation of what we created as a hospital. It doesn't mean everybody in the hospital is racist, let's be clear, but the foundation of the systems that have built healthcare in pediatrics in Minnesota are racist. So in order to go against that, I got to make sure that I have the support of not only the coalition members, but other people to say, well, JB, yeah, you need to do something different. Like, yeah, the system here has got to change, but it's not going to change overnight, as Marcus said. It's not going to change in a year. And I think we need to be honest with that about all the different corporations and nonprofits too. Because every business here, not just children's, is built upon that same foundation. In order to change that, we got to support that work. The other thing I'll say is, to your point, Shannon, we got to hold each other accountable. When we try to go back and do something and it doesn't work out, we got to get some more people together. Get the United Way, get Children's, get ALF, get Hope Community, get your sister on here somewhere, get the Minneapolis Foundation, and get other people together to be like, you know what, we're not going to accept that anymore. One of our partners, I forget the company, made a silly statement around not being able to find Black talent about 6-7 months ago. In the past, we'd ignore that, but we said, no, we're not going to ignore that. We're going to hold you accountable. What you're going to do differently, show us, rather than say you apologize for saying the stupid comment. And I admit they've shown us in certain ways, and part of them is invested in this Black bank has been that, but you got to hold folks accountable to doing that, to that change as well. So I think all of those things are important, as you mentioned too, Shannon.
Thank you, JB. And as we wait for folks to pull their questions, I know we're getting to question and answer time. I have one more question to you all. As we're talking about the challenges and the wins and the benefit of coalition building, what advice would you give to individuals or organizations that want to enter into a coalition or are thinking about it?
Begin with the end in mind. And by end, I mean kind of ultimate end user or end recipient or whatever action that you are pursuing, and really leaning into that group to help define the problem and corresponding solutions, and recognize that that is often counterintuitive and countercultural. And so, I think creating the space and guardrails for how you will conduct yourselves in partnership, I think is also really important, because then you've got a shared language for not only accountability to advance the cause, but accountability for how you engage with one another, that I think is really helpful, particularly when you get to those step points.
Yeah, I think that's great, Akua. I think what I would add on top of that is that when you think about the end user, is like, what are you going to contribute to the end user? Oftentimes we come in, we just want to impact the end user, but we forget, like, well, what are we actually going to contribute to that? Are we going to hire people? Are we going to, change policy? Are we going to, give resources? Are we going to build capacity? What is it that you're uniquely able to give to that coalition so that it can impact the end user at the end of the day and not just continue to be talk?
I'd say that's dead on. I think the other thing is, what I want to do at some point is to walk down the street in North Minneapolis, go to my barber shop, talk to a brother and sister on the street and say, hey, are things better here for Black people after we've done what we're going to do? And get an answer that they know and they have felt that change as well. It can't just be a high level conversation. It's got to affect people on the streets in their day-to-day as well. So hopefully that's something we can see a change in.
Excellent. Shannon, do you got any other questions you want to throw out there? JB?
Not right now. I'm curious if JB or Akua does.
Yeah.
Or if the audience has any.
I got one for Shannon.
Yeah.
Why haven't you given up yet on this? You're a nonprofit in this corporate-led, corporate-focused, all about the corporations organization. Why haven't you thrown in the towel and said, I'm done with this?
You knew to ask me that question because I probably I probably send a text message every other week saying I'm quitting. Oh my gosh. I think I see what I see is the potential. I see that I'm watching our internal narrative shift as we're pushing on these systems, on these organizations, on these corporations. From the time we joined the coalition, I'm watching the language shift. I'm watching the approach shift. And I'm seeing that that has a huge impact. And I believe that, I think Akua kind of talked about like, what is my role in influencing a better Minnesota for Black Minnesotans? You know, like I'm 4th, 5th generation Northsider, like I'm deeply vested in this community and in this place and space. And I want it to be good for not just me, but for the generations, you know, my 4 or 5 generations down the line that may still be here. And I think that corporations have, sorry about my background noise, it's not Jamaica, it's just the dog running down the stairs. But I believe that corporations have such an influence over the tone of what happens in who wins, who benefits, right? They have a big piece of that. And so to really talk about what influencing that looks like and being able to see milestones and being able to see the shifts happening kind of keep me in it. But it is an exhausting space to be in. In all honesty, if it weren't for you three in the space, I probably would have left. So if I did not have, you know, that the text message that I could send with a WTF, is that what I just heard? Or, you know, if I didn't have that, or, you know, the filter-free Fridays, or those moments where we can release and vent and then, you know, like, and then encourage one another, I would have probably thrown the towel in. I do see a question here from Ebony. And I'm wondering, Marcus, if you would be the best one, and feel free you all to jump into this, but how do you make sure community voice is informing the work?
Yes, you know, this is probably one of the hardest things to happen because, you know, community there's different parts of community that make up this work. You have the 4 of us that are part of community, but oftentimes when you get in the space of coalition building, they rely on the Black person that's in the room to speak for all community. And that's hard because that's a lot of pressure on us because we're actually in it to do the work, right? And bring our perspectives as individuals and leaders in our own right. But the process of actually making community the decision maker is a challenging concept because oftentimes it's people in a room making decisions. And particularly when you think about corporate spaces, like that's how decisions are made. There isn't, you know, the coalition of the willing or the coalition of the many. It's, yo, we're going to get the 5 of us in a room, we're going to iron out and we're going to make a decision and go. But through this coalition, I think what we've talked about is like, we need community voice. We need community listening. We need to have, I mean, we have budget for creating community listening sessions around just what's happening in the space that we're trying to impact, right? Our work at ALF is to, as we came into the coalition, and I mean, I can spend a whole hour just talking about how we got into all of this, but just the idea that, you know, we have this voice, or we have, you know, this network of 6,000 people, you know, 700 of which are active contributors that are saying, what's happening in community and how do we bring that voice into the space? You know, through our Black Center design process, we want to bring both the metrics and the vision to community through listening sessions, through surveys, through other engagements where people can actually have conversation and affirm what we're hearing and what we're saying. So that when we get back to the space of the coalition, we can say, community has affirmed this, so we should move forward now. And then the other part of it is making sure that what we're supporting is actually coming from the community and not just being done to the community. So if the coalition is going to do work, it should be supporting community-based organizations, community-led efforts, community-centered efforts that have been, again, affirmed by community. So it's all around who gets to make the decision in all this, and making sure every time that we go back to, okay, a decision needs to be made, it's not the 13 people in the steering committee or the 80 companies. but it's community telling us and guiding us through this whole process. It's not easy, it's not pretty, but you know, we got to build that coalition of the willing so that they keep coming in and saying, yes, you're on the right path. Yeah, that's probably where I would start.
Akua or JB, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, the other piece I would say is the part of what makes that question especially difficult to ask is that there isn't a perfect way to do that. There isn't a perfect community process. There are always going to be voices that somehow are inadvertently missed. And so granting yourself the space to grant grace and to continually learn, test, try, reiterate that process and remaining open to hearing, I think is super important.
Yeah, I mean, through that, I mean, and Akua, you said it, like the grace part, because even when you get in position where you're supposed to be the one to do it, you have to continue to build trust. And like trust is like a fleeting, you know, change in your pocket in community, because there's just the history that we have in community. And it's like, how do you constantly go back and say, let's not forget that we're all in this for the same thing, so let's work together. But trust is a key element to any listening or making sure that voice is in there. And it's a constant, you have to earn it day in and day out. There's no days off.
I think one of the things you both touched on is the time that it takes. And I think that is, when we're talking about corporations or even our own business models, nonprofit, we're like, bop, 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 bop. We have first quarter, second quarter, you know, like we're on a timeline. We're trying to get to decisions. Community does not work on our fiscal calendar. And if we want to really incorporate that voice, we have to slow our work down sometimes to check back in and take the time to do that. And it is counterintuitive to the way many of us are socialized into the workforce. And it's anxiety ridden sometimes, right? Like, cause you want to know and you want to push past it, but pushing past it is why we're on the sidelines, right? Is because no one has stopped long enough to ask us what we actually wanted in community before they built it, right? They didn't ask us what stores we wanted or what we needed. They didn't do those things, and then they built things up and said, why aren't you using it? Or why aren't you utilizing these resources? And so we have to slow things down.
I see the dog agrees.
Yeah,
I think you also got to, you know, rather than do a community listening session sometimes, how about you put people from the community on your board? But rather than do a community feedback session, how about you hire people from the community as your engineers, your designers, your architects, your customer relations people. So you got community there at the table. They don't represent all the Black people in the world, but at least you have somebody at the table who then can connect you to others as well. So I think, you know, we got to be authentic in that community engagement, not just come in to do the same old community meetings, but hire different people, put them on the boards, put them in leadership roles as well. So I think that's a part of community we don't talk about enough, is just changing how we do business and how we do relationships to make sure the community voice is heard.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, great. So we'll Akua, go for it.
Can I ask a question of the audience and y'all can put the answers in the chat?
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, for those who had already heard about MBCRE, if there was anything new that you heard today, or for anyone listening, what were the compelling parts from our conversation? That'll help. I mean, we're doing more and more of these conversations, and it will be helpful to know what's landing and where we might need to do a bit more development.
That's a great question.
You could also unmute and talk if it's easier to do that.
Catherine put in, never heard. So that's good. This is a moment for you to to learn. Tap in, as they say. That's what the young folks say, I think. That's what my daughter told me, at least.
You are young folks.
I was about to say that is a pure sign of being older when you say the young folks say. You just otherized yourself, Marcus.
Embracing it. I'm embracing it. Okay, so thank you, Tina said the humanists and the people we work with. Yep, yep. It's great, thank you. Okay, so there's a lot. Marcus used to be the young one. Yes, I'm over the hill, they say now, I guess, but that's a whole nother conversation.
The trust we have with each other. Yeah, that is very key. I would say that's one of the most key. I mean, out of the work, we know where we're going, but I think if we did not have that,
yeah,
the work would be that much more challenging. I don't know if any of us would have endured it, to be honest.
No, we wouldn't have.
Yep. I quit 5 times a week, and then I remember I got you guys. Then I keep going.
Marcus got dragged to this. At some point, you will have the unfiltered version of this conversation. He got dragged, kicking and screaming to break up a fight. It was like, all right, Marcus, you break up the fight because we about to fight. And Alps came to the rescue. So that'll be the part 2 of this conversation. But we're not gonna have that conversation today.
You sound like Martin and Gina, where they would have 2 different stories about
Exactly. What had happened was, yeah. The other thing I'll say is just you gotta have fun too with this, folks. This is some serious work and pushing and lifting, but as you can see, we enjoy each other's company. We enjoy being with each other. We enjoy, just being there for each other, our kids, our families, and other places as well. So I'd say for people getting into this work, make sure that you enjoy the people and also to build your own relationship outside of the work. It's important as well.
That's right. That's right.
So
Great.
I think we're kind of wrapped up here, Ebony. I don't know what you have to add or if you're closing us up here.
Yeah, if you want to close out this session, and then I'll close out the summit. So either you or Marcus.
Yeah, okay, Marcus. So I appreciate everybody coming today. I really hope that as you're entering into this space of coalition building, that one, I hope this lit up the complexities of it. It's complex work, right? There's many different moving pieces. People have different vested interests, and we're trying to align all of those things and different approaches toward an end goal. And it takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of heart. But I think if you have the right relationships and the right folks, that we really can have a huge impact, no matter what the work is that you're doing. And so I think one of the interesting things about this coalition is just the cross-sector relationship between nonprofits, corporate, and I have not seen one of the coalitions with as many Black leaders. And so I'm excited to be a part of it. It is exhausting, but I'm glad to be a part of the good work. It's good work. And so on that, if people don't have any more questions or last words, I will hand it over to Ebony. And I also want to say a huge thank you to Akua, who took time out of her vacation. She's the real MVP today to show up and share her expertise. JB, for coming as always, bringing your true authentic self to the space. I will get nothing less all the time. So I appreciate that consistency. And Marcus, as always, I feel like we end up at these tables all the time. So thank you so much for bringing yourselves to this work.
Thank you, everyone. And real quick, before I do a closeout, I also just want to say a thank you to Marcus, Shannon, JB, if I can call you JB, and Akoa for your wisdom for today. I do want to give my colleague Vanna the stage for just 1 second, just in follow up around the call to action. So Vanna, I'm gonna let you address the participants, and before I close us out on that call to action.
Great, thank you, Ebony. I wanted to hop back in. I tried to share my screen here, but I wanted to hop back in. Maddie, if you would give me screen sharing ability, just to make sure folks understood how to send off the email. I don't think a lot of our last panelists were on when we sent out the call to action. The link is in the chat. I'll repost it in a second, but wanted to make sure folks knew how to send this email. Again, the call to action is around some ARPA funds, the remaining ARPA funds that are going to be in Minnesota and going to be spent in Minnesota, and just emailing your legislators to provide input on how those funds should be used. So investing those funds into BIPOC and low-income communities. When you open the link to the call to action, you'll see a screen like this. This may prompt you to register on the right side of the screen. Just enter your name, your address. That way we can pull up your legislators and it'll be easy to send the email. But you'll get to a screen like this, and hopefully you all can see my screen pretty quickly. But I saw like 1 or 2 people send this email as is. This is something for you to edit. This is just pre-filled text. It'll pre-fill your legislator's name so you can see it pre-filled senator. It'll pre-fill your name here. I don't know who Anna is, but it pre-filled for her. But if you all would just delete this text and enter whatever you would like to enter, whatever you'd like to tell your legislator in terms of how to spend that ARPA funding. That's the goal, is to send this email and let folks know, let your legislators know how you'd like to see that funding spent. So on housing in the community, on just any type of economic development, or whatever it is that you want to write, just do that. And you'll have to go through, you can copy and paste whatever you put here, just paste it into the other emails here. But again, I saw someone on the back end send the email, and it said the email was sent literally with insert text here still there. So I wanted to make sure everyone was clear on how to do it. But once you've inserted that, it's really easy. Just hit submit selected letters and they'll go directly to your legislators. Your legislators will respond directly to your email address. So thanks, Ebony, for giving me the floor. I just wanted to make sure folks understood how to send these emails.
You are welcome. And Marcus, I did see your message in the chat box. We will be sending out a list of all the participants that was on here today as well.
Yeah, and I just want to just double tap what Vanna said. Like, if you send a specific request like this type of work or this thing, send me an email, please. And I'll put my email in the chat, because we're going in the process of making recommendations about the $1.15 billion over the next 3 weeks. So anything that I can then bring to the council, there's other organizations like Metropolitan Consortium of Community Developers, Hospitality Minnesota, they've all sent some type of letter to the council. This is 13 members from across the state that are trying to make recommendations to the governor. So please send me what you have, particularly this group, because you all are dynamic and I know your work, but formalize it so that I can put it up into the reporting that and shows that there's this interest in this advocacy coming from our community.
All right, thank you, Marcus. So real quick, I'm gonna go ahead and close us out. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank all of my organizations that are part of the Building High Impact for Nonprofits of Color work, and our guest panelists and speakers for your partnership on this summit, and all the rich conversation that has come from it. I also want to thank the rest of my Prosperity Now colleague that has been on here helping to execute this meeting, in particular, Vanna Cure and Madeline Santana, and really helping us and the leaders with this. I also want to just join everyone for just taking time out of their day today to just be really part of this conversation and engage in this conversation. And I hope you got some real actionable things to do, got some motivation, some more incentives to stay engaged, to advocate for a more equitable community. And if you like what you heard today, we do have meeting materials that will be available, that we will be sending out, as well as a recording of the video. We also will have some bios of all the Building High Impact for Nonprofits of Color leaders to tell you a little bit more intimately about their work, as well as bios of all of our speakers today. And so I hope you reach out to them directly to help move this conversation into some action. Again, thank you everyone for just being here today, and have a good one.